Tartaria, or Tartary, is a name that appears frequently across a wide array of historical maps from the 16th to the 19th centuries, often covering large swathes of northern and central Asia, including areas today considered part of Russia, China, and Mongolia. The term has become a point of contention in modern historical investigations. The mainstream academic consensus views Tartary as a loosely defined region used by Western cartographers to describe parts of Asia that were unfamiliar or only partially documented. Yet the regularity and scope of the name's presence, combined with its abrupt disappearance from maps and historical literature, has spurred alternative interpretations. In this section, the investigation begins by outlining the contours of what is referred to as the Tartaria question. Was Tartaria simply a placeholder for European ignorance, or was it the cartographic residue of a forgotten empire? The task at hand is not to validate or debunk Tartaria as a real civilization outright, but to understand the mechanisms by which it entered and exited the historical record. The initial approach centers on the cartographic archive, tracing the evolution of how the region was represented on maps. The objective is to establish the baseline from which anomalies can be identified. What stands out immediately is the sheer consistency with which Tartary appears on maps spanning centuries, often occupying prime geographical space with significant territorial boundaries, cities, and features. These depictions, though inconsistent in detail, suggest a perception of cohesion, not of an empty wilderness or a terra incognita. It is important to emphasize that Tartaria is not presented in these maps as a mythical realm akin to Atlantis or El Dorado. Instead, it is depicted with names of regions, rivers, cities, and in some cases, suggested trade routes. This level of specificity creates tension with the notion that it was merely a label for unknown lands. Furthermore, its disappearance is not gradual but sudden. By the late 19th century, the term vanishes almost entirely from major atlases and encyclopedias. This abrupt transition invites scrutiny. What caused this change? Did the underlying geopolitical structure dissolve, or did the narrative infrastructure of empire overwrite a competing historical memory? To begin a methodical investigation, one must establish the interplay between geography, power, and knowledge. Cartography is not a neutral activity. Maps are cultural documents shaped by the political, religious, and economic interests of their creators. A name on a map is not just a reference point, it is a statement of recognition, of conceptual existence. Conversely, the removal of a name is an erasure, whether accidental or intentional. By this logic, the appearance and disappearance of Tartaria are not trivial anomalies, but potential clues pointing to shifts in who gets to define reality. Another layer of complexity arises when one considers that Tartaria was not depicted on maps of a single origin. Its presence is found in Dutch, French, British, German, and Italian cartographic traditions. This suggests a shared consensus, or at least a shared convention, across national boundaries. If it was a placeholder born of ignorance, why was it applied so uniformly and retained for so long? If it was meant to be a general term for land of the Tatars, why did the specifics of its geography remain relatively stable, even as the European understanding of Asia deepened? The issue extends beyond maps. Contemporary texts, travelogues, and early encyclopedic works refer to Tartaria with varying degrees of certainty. Sometimes it is linked to the Mongol Empire or the broader region ruled by Genghis Khan's descendants. At other times, it is presented as an autonomous civilization with its own customs and structures. The inconsistency in narrative, however, does not dilute the central observation. The name persists, often with a tone of recognition rather than myth. This section also frames the central methodological constraint. Historical knowledge is filtered through institutions with vested interests. The Enlightenment, the colonial era, and the subsequent scientific age prioritized specific forms of evidence while excluding others. Oral traditions, anomalous artifacts, and unconventional interpretations were sidelined in favor of linear, document-based narratives. Within this context, Tartaria's marginalization becomes intelligible not as a correction of error, but as a reconfiguration of acceptable knowledge. There is, of course, the risk of overinterpretation. Not every omission is sinister, and not every anomaly signals a hidden truth. But the investigation gains relevance from its broader implications. If a name like Tartaria can dominate maps for centuries and then vanish without substantial historical commentary, what does that suggest about the reliability of official history? If there was once a political or cultural entity occupying that space, what mechanisms contributed to its conceptual deletion? The inquiry thus begins with an acknowledgement of uncertainty and a commitment to critical rigor. Tartaria is neither embraced as a lost utopia nor dismissed as a cartographic curiosity. It is treated as a phenomenon worthy of investigation precisely because of its liminal status, neither fully fictional nor fully acknowledged. From this vantage point, subsequent sections will examine the historical, geopolitical, cartographic, and philosophical dimensions of Tartaria's presence and erasure. This investigation does not claim to offer definitive answers. Instead, it follows the anomalies, inconsistencies, and silences embedded in the record. It does not seek to prove the existence of a lost empire, but to interrogate the forces that determine what is remembered and what is forgotten. In that sense, Tartaria serves as both subject and mirror, a way to examine not only what may have been lost, but also how loss is constructed. The journey begins with the maps, but it will move beyond them, to architecture, linguistics, historiography, and digital resurrection. At each step, the question will remain constant. What happened to Tartaria, and what does that question reveal about the nature of history itself? A survey of early modern cartography reveals a striking and recurrent feature: the persistent and detailed inclusion of a region labeled Tartaria. From the maps of Ortelius and Mercator to those published by Blaeu and Hohmann, Tartaria occupies a vast landmass stretching from the Ural Mountains to the Pacific Ocean and from the Arctic Circle down toward Persia and India. Its territorial dimensions often rival or exceed those of the Roman Empire at its height. Yet, what is most perplexing is not merely the geographic scale, but the frequency and specificity with which this region appears across a spectrum of European maps spanning over 3 centuries. The term Tartaria is rarely accompanied by questioners, marks, speculative boundaries, or symbolic notations of the unknown. Instead, it is populated with place names, cities, rivers, and topographical features, often with cultural or political annotations. Terms such as Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, and Muscovite Tartary indicate internal divisions and suggest a taxonomy of regions within a larger geopolitical identity. Such naming conventions imply knowledge, not speculation. The maps do not present Tartaria as a void, but as a region with established political geography. This challenges the assertion that it was a mere placeholder for the unknown. Compounding the anomaly is the consistency in nomenclature across divergent national cartographic traditions. French, Dutch, British, Italian, and German mapmakers, each with their own colonial ambitions and religious agendas, converge on similar representations of Tartary. This convergence becomes even more conspicuous when juxtaposed with regions like Africa or the interior of South America, where contemporary maps frequently included notations such as terra incognita or illustrations of mythical creatures. In contrast, Tartaria is treated as a coherent civilizational block. This raises the question, why would Western mapmakers attribute such uniformity to a supposedly ambiguous or uncivilized territory? Some defenders of the mainstream view argue that Tartary was a general label for the lands inhabited by the Tatars, a broad umbrella term encompassing numerous Turkic and Mongolic nomadic groups. While this explanation is partially valid, it fails to account for the degree of political and structural coherence attributed to the region in cartographic materials. Moreover, the Tatars themselves were often portrayed as politically fragmented, with varying degrees of allegiance to external powers such as the Qing dynasty or the Russian Tsardom. Yet the maps do not reflect this fragmentation. Instead, they often represent Tartaria as contiguous and organized, a single entity with legible boundaries. The issue of temporal persistence further complicates matters. If Tartaria was simply a cartographic convenience, one would expect its usage to decline as explorers, missionaries, and traders brought back more accurate reports from Central and East Asia. However, even as European contact with China and Siberia intensified during the 17th and 18th centuries, the label persisted. Jesuit missions in China and Russian expeditions across Siberia contributed to the growing body of geographic knowledge, yet Tartaria remained a staple feature of European maps well into the early 1800s. Only in the mid to late 19th century does the term begin to vanish, replaced by more granular designations such as Siberia, Central Asia, and Manchuria. This abrupt terminological transition lacks a clear justification in the historical record. There is no pivotal moment, no major conference, no widely cited decree marking the end of Tartaria as a geographic concept. The structure of these maps also deserves attention. Many contain visual symmetries, carefully drafted city markers, fortifications, and roads, features that suggest a level of development inconsistent with the modern portrayal of Tartaria as a nomadic wasteland. Certain maps go so far as to include illustrations of domed buildings, straight-lined road networks, and rectangular city layouts. These are not characteristics typically ascribed to steppe societies. Their presence raises doubts about whether the label Tartaria was ever meant to denote a society of purely tribal or migratory composition. Instead, the visual language implies urbanization and infrastructural sophistication. The phenomenon of disappearing place names also surfaces in this context. Cities and settlements that appear frequently on earlier maps, such as Arzareth, Cathay, or Karakoram, either change names or vanish altogether in later editions. Some are absorbed into Russian or Chinese nomenclatures, while others disappear, without archaeological or administrative trace. The implication is clear. Either the original mapmakers were drawing from a corpus of now lost knowledge, or later mapmakers deliberately restructured geographic memory to align with new political realities. Another angle of analysis emerges from the treatment of Tartaria in globes and atlas collections. Prominent atlases of the 17th century, including those by Willem Bleu and Vincenzo Coronelli, devote entire pages to Tartaria, sometimes complete with annotations regarding its climate, customs, and supposed rulers. These texts rarely present the region as mythical or irrelevant. Instead, they regard it as part of the known world, even if partially misunderstood. In modern historiography, this raises an epistemological contradiction. How can a region once so clearly depicted be now so utterly absent? What paradigm shift in cartographic logic or historical thought accounts for this disappearance? The possibility that Tartaria was an empire, decentralized but structured, is not easily dismissed by conventional historiography without raising further questions. Was Tartaria politically independent? Was it a tributary system spanning multiple ethnicities and polities? Was it suppressed in historical memory due to its ideological incompatibility with rising European narratives of civilizational superiority. The maps alone cannot answer these questions, but they do offer evidence of a structured entity that merits deeper investigation. Cartographic artifacts are not immune to fabrication or error. Nonetheless, the persistence and specificity of Tartaria's presence across multiple centuries and traditions suggests something more than a simple mistake. It suggests a conceptual framework that was at some point deemed acceptable, perhaps even necessary, for representing the world. Its erasure from subsequent maps, therefore, signals not just a refinement of knowledge but a realignment of accepted truths. The shifting borders, renaming of territories, and disappearance of Tartaria from both visual and textual sources are part of a broader pattern, the periodic rewriting of geography to reflect political imperatives. In this light, the early maps function not as obsolete documents but as forensic evidence. They reveal not only what was seen but also how it was interpreted and framed. They show what was deemed worthy of recording and what, in time, became inconvenient to remember. The anomaly of Tartaria is not its inclusion on old maps, it is the silence that follows its removal. The classification of Tartaria within early cartographic sources and geographic literature raises a critical question about the nature of historical ignorance versus strategic ambiguity. Was Tartaria truly a terra incognita, a region shrouded in geographical mystery due to the limits of exploration and communication? Or was it a known but inconvenient geography later suppressed as part of a systematic restructuring of world history? To confront this question, it is necessary to scrutinize the mechanisms by which regions were designated as unknown, the political utility of such designations, and the ways in which mapmakers participated in constructing, preserving, or dismantling geographic memory. European maps from the 16th to 18th centuries often included vast expanses labeled terra incognita. These terms were not merely confessions of ignorance but served practical functions. They demarcated the limits of imperial authority, justified future exploration, and signaled areas open to theological and commercial conquest. However, Tartaria was rarely described in these terms. Its boundaries were delineated, cities named, and physical features marked with relative consistency. This treatment runs counter to the labeling conventions typically applied to unknown or unexplored lands. Unlike the deep interiors of Africa or the unmapped Arctic, Tartaria was embedded within a matrix of connected geographies bordering Muscovy, China, Persia, and the Caspian Sea, all of which were increasingly documented through trade, war, and diplomacy. This positioning complicates the narrative of ignorance. Tartaria was not located at the edge of the known world, but in the heart of the Eurasian landmass. Its consistent presence on maps suggests a level of referential stability incompatible with the idea of an unknown space. It was not a blank slate to be filled in, but a defined space to be explained. The problem then may not be that Tartaria was unknown, but that it was known in ways inconvenient to emerging narratives of civilization and empire. Historical knowledge, particularly in the early modern period, was a composite of exploration, hearsay, clerical documentation, and strategic fiction. In this epistemological terrain, the boundary between what was unknown and what was unspeakable was thin. Declaring a region terra incognita could be an honest admission or a calculated omission. In the case of Tartaria, the label was not applied. Instead, what emerges is an increasingly uncomfortable silence in the academic and political record, a silence that grows louder as European imperial structures solidify. The reclassification of Tartaria begins to accelerate. In the 19th century, Russian imperial cartography absorbs the territory into a rebranded Siberia, fragmenting it into smaller administrative units. Chinese cartography, heavily influenced by Qing consolidation, reclaims Manchuria and Inner Asia. Western maps begin, replacing Tartaria with familiar imperial labels, rendering it legible in terms consistent with modern statecraft. This shift is not accompanied by open debate or explanation. There is no published rationale for why the term disappears, only a steady replacement of one schema with another. This pattern aligns less with new discovery and more with ideological reorganization. Strategic ambiguity operates as a tool of power. By presenting a region as undefined or irrelevant, imperial systems can erase histories without engaging in visible destruction. What is not named cannot be claimed, and what is not mapped cannot be contested. The act of reclassifying Tartaria into administrative units like the Siberian Federal District or the Far Eastern Republic was not just a cartographic decision, but a geopolitical maneuver. It converted a potentially autonomous civilizational space into a controllable and forgettable geography. This transformation allowed the past to be rewritten in favor of the present. The process of historical suppression does not always involve active censorship. Often it operates through obsolescence. Names disappear from textbooks, regions are renamed in public discourse, and previous representations are dismissed as outdated. Tartaria becomes a ghost, not because it was disproven, but because it was overwritten. The erasure becomes more effective when reinforced by academic inertia. Modern historians, trained within institutional frameworks that prioritize post-Enlightenment rationality and Eurocentric chronologies, rarely revisit the conceptual assumptions of their maps and terminologies. The designation of Tartaria as suppressed geography gains traction in this context. It shifts the burden of explanation from map makers to institutions. If Tartaria was an error, why did the error persist for so long and across so many authorities? If it was an accurate term for a historical region, why was its removal so thorough and undocumented? The absence of scholarly engagement on these questions suggests a deeper discomfort, a recognition that revisiting Tartaria might unravel parts of the modern world's accepted historical structure. To be clear, the case for suppression does not rest solely on the presence of Tartaria in old maps. It rests on the cumulative pattern of representation, consistency, and disappearance without explanation. Suppressed geography functions not as a conspiracy but as a paradigm. It describes the ways in which geographic knowledge is manufactured, policed, and revised to align with prevailing power structures. In this light, Tartaria's vanishing act becomes a case study in how history is not merely written, but actively curated. One cannot ignore the role of empire in this curation. The British, French, Russian, and later American empires had vested interests in simplifying global geography into manageable categories. Complex or ambiguous regions posed a threat to narrative clarity. By converting Tartaria into smaller, nameable components, cartographers provided imperial administrators with the tools of control. This process was replicated in other parts of the world. Africa's interior was divided into colonies, the Indian subcontinent was sectioned into princely states, and the Middle East was drawn into lines of mandate. Tartaria's fragmentation follows this logic. The investigation must now begin to consider what lies beneath the cartographic shifts. Were there actual cities, fortresses, or systems of governance that the maps once documented? If so, what happened to them? Were they destroyed, assimilated, or deliberately ignored? If not, why did such specificity appear in the first place? These questions demand a multidisciplinary approach, drawing from archaeology, ethnography, climatology, and historical linguistics. But before reaching these domains, one must establish the legitimacy of the question itself. That is the task. This section completes. Tartaria's disappearance from geography was not a function of discovery, but a process of reinterpretation. It was made unknown not because it never existed, but because its existence no longer served the purposes of those who controlled the map. Whether it was an empire, a culture, or a cartographic illusion, Tartaria challenges the boundaries between fact and frame, between what is remembered and what is allowed to be remembered. The context in which Tartaria maintained visibility on European maps coincides with the height of imperial expansion by Western powers. Between the 16th and 19th centuries, maritime empires consolidated territorial control through conquest, commerce, and cartographic dominance. During this period, knowledge became a resource as valuable as land, the construction of geographic reality, who existed where and under what form of governance, was not just an academic pursuit, but an instrument of empire. Within this framework, the representation of Tartaria reveals more than territorial ambiguity. It exposes the ideological filters through which Europe perceived and structured the world beyond its immediate domain. Tartaria's positioning at the frontier of Russian, Persian, Chinese, and Ottoman spheres made it a geopolitical anomaly in the imperial imagination. It was neither fully assimilated into existing power blocks nor entirely detached from them. Its liminality posed a representational challenge. Unlike India, which was gradually absorbed into British control and thus cartographically stabilized, or the Americas, which were framed as virgin lands awaiting civilization, Tartaria remained a semi-articulated space. Its cartographic identity refused binary classification. It was neither wholly sovereign nor colonized, neither fully barbaric nor familiar. This status, though superficially ambiguous, was politically potent. It rendered Tartaria a malleable object for competing imperial narratives. The European treatment of Central Asia, and Tartaria in particular, must be situated within a broader epistemological project, the creation of a global historical order compatible with European ascendancy. In this order, civilizational prestige and historical legitimacy were allocated in accordance with visibility in European records. Societies that left no clear textual trail were labeled as primitive, while those whose achievements could be appropriated were selectively acknowledged. The Tartarian question defies this logic. Despite the consistent presence of cities, names and borders on maps, Tartaria was never granted a stable narrative position within imperial historiography. It was drawn but not described, named but not explained. This silence did not emerge in a vacuum. It mirrored the practical difficulties that European powers encountered in asserting influence over the region. The harsh climate, vast distances, and decentralized forms of governance inhibited the kind of administrative and economic integration that colonial regimes depended on. Unlike coastal Asia or Africa, which could be subdued through naval power, Tartaria's inland vastness resisted insertion into colonial circuits. Its marginalization in history can be read as an extension of its marginalization in empire. It was a space too large to be ignored, but too complex to be assimilated into the prevailing imperial framework. As a result, it was left in limbo, present in maps but absent in meaning. Yet the absence of meaning was not neutral. It served a strategic function. By leaving Tartaria unexamined or vaguely attributed to Mongol remnants, European powers could sidestep difficult questions about non-Westernly development. Acknowledging the possibility of an advanced civilization in the heart of Eurasia, independent from Western influence and possibly equal in scale to Rome or Byzantium, would disrupt the narrative of Western exceptionalism. The path of least resistance was to categorize it as a relic of nomadic disorder, preserved in maps for the sake of convention, but excluded from serious historical inquiry. This exclusion is particularly visible in the development of academic disciplines during the 18th and 19th centuries. As history, archaeology, and ethnography professionalized, they increasingly depended on textual evidence and material artifacts that could be catalogued within museum logic. Tartaria offered neither in abundance. Its cities, if they existed, had been abandoned or repurposed. Its records, if they were kept, did not conform to European archival standards. Lacking such validation, Tartaria became epistemically inconvenient. To integrate it would require expanding the evidentiary framework in ways that undermine the authority of the new disciplines. Rather than adapt, institutions chose to erase. The Russian Empire played a central role in this erasure. As it expanded eastward, it absorbed vast territories previously labeled as Tartaria. In doing so, it reframed these regions as part of Russian geography. The incorporation was both territorial and conceptual. Place names were changed or Russified, ethnic groups were reclassified, and previous political structures were overwritten. This allowed Russian historiography to present the expansion not as conquest, but as reclamation. The region, once ambiguous, was now firmly within the orbit of the Tsar. Western maps followed suit, replacing Great Tartary with Siberia or Russian Asia. The transformation was thus not merely semantic, it was ideological, legitimizing imperial control through historical revision. Chinese authorities executed a similar transformation. The Qing dynasty's campaigns in Inner Asia gradually redefined large parts of eastern Tartaria as Manchuria or Xinjiang, integrating them into the imperial framework. This process involved both military suppression and narrative control. Qing historians documented their conquests in terms of unification and restoration, mirroring the rhetorical strategies of their Russian counterparts. As with the Russian case, this reframing was mirrored in Western cartography, which began to adopt Chinese nomenclature for regions that had previously been under the Tartarian designation. The cumulative effect of these shifts was to render Tartaria cartographically obsolete and historically irrelevant, not through any singular act of suppression, but through a series of cumulative decisions, each motivated by the need to align geopolitical expansion with historiographical clarity. The result was a disappearance that looked like progress. As the maps improved in precision, the territory shrank in cultural significance. As imperial narratives solidified, alternative histories were abandoned. The more accurate the maps became, the less they seemed to remember. This paradox must be acknowledged. In any investigation of Tartaria, greater technical accuracy did not lead to greater historical transparency. In fact, the opposite occurred. Precision became a vehicle for forgetting. The edges of empire, once filled with uncertain possibilities, were redrawn into manageable categories. The complexity of Tartaria was erased under the guise of clarity. It is not that Tartaria was disproven, but that it was disarticulated, its coherence dissolved, its components redistributed, its legacy ignored. The challenge now is not simply to resurrect Tartaria as a political entity, but to understand the forces that rendered it invisible. This involves peeling back the layers of cartographic convenience, imperial narrative, and academic orthodoxy that together conspired to neutralize its significance. Tartaria becomes not just a lost land, but a diagnostic tool, a way to measure the distortions introduced when history is written from the center outward and when the margins are treated as voids. The Jesuit order, formerly known as the Society of Jesus, occupied a central position in the early modern production and dissemination of geographic knowledge. Founded in the 16th century as a militant wing of the Catholic Counter-Reformation, the Jesuits quickly became global agents of not only religious conversion, but also scientific exploration, cartographic intelligence, and cultural documentation. Their missions extended deep into Asia, Africa, and the Americas, and their involvement in the mapping of Tartaria demands critical attention. Far from passive observers, Jesuit cartographers acted as intermediaries between local realities and European epistemologies. Their role in the formulation of Tartaria as both a concept and a territory must be evaluated in the context of their dual allegiance to the spiritual imperatives of the Vatican and to the imperial ambitions of Catholic monarchies. The cartographic output of the Jesuits was not neutral. Their maps were tools of doctrinal vision, often reflecting theological priorities as much as geographic precision. The Jesuits' presence in China, for instance, led to the integration of Chinese cosmology with European techniques, producing maps that simultaneously legitimized Qing territorial claims and fulfilled the Vatican's geopolitical interests. Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci and Martino Martini were among the first Europeans to provide detailed accounts of East and Central Asia. Their works became reference points for generations of European mapmakers. Yet in translating local knowledge into European frameworks, the Jesuits necessarily filtered, selected and recontextualized data to align with both Christian metaphysics and Western strategic calculus. In this light, the depiction of Tartaria on maps influenced by Jesuit sources takes on a layered character. It is not just a question of accuracy, but of narrative framing. Regions that resisted Christianization or operated outside recognizable state structures were often rendered vague or hostile. Tartaria, occupying a liminal space between known empires and indigenous autonomy, fell into this category. While the Jesuits collected data from Mongol, Turkic, and Siberian populations, they did so with a selective lens, privileging information that conformed to their doctrinal goals. The vastness of Tartaria was often depicted, but its internal complexity was flattened. Cities were named but not described, rulers were referenced but not contextualized, and local customs were either ignored or pathologized. This produced a map that acknowledged Tartaria's existence but neutralized its significance. Theological assumptions also played a direct role. Jesuit cosmography was rooted in a Christian teleology that viewed history as a linear progression from pagan darkness to Christian enlightenment. Societies that did not fit this schema were either temporally displaced, treated as relics of a past stage of development, or spatially displaced, rendered peripheral to the historical narrative. Tartaria, with its fusion of animist, Buddhist, and Islamic traditions, could not be easily integrated into this framework. Its marginalization in Jesuit texts was therefore not accidental, but ideological. By failing to represent Tartaria as a dynamic or sovereign entity, Jesuit mapmakers contributed to its gradual erasure from the Western historical consciousness. This erasure was not purely textual. Jesuit cartography exerted significant influence over the physical production of maps across Europe. Jesuit academies in Rome, Paris, and Lisbon served as centers of cartographic training. Manuscripts and printed atlases were circulated widely, shaping the templates used by commercial publishers and state-sponsored explorers alike. The conventions established by Jesuit sources became self-reinforcing. Future mapmakers, relying on their predecessors for authority, replicated the structural marginalization of regions like Tartaria. Over time, this process solidified a geography in which Tartaria existed only as a buffer, present but undefined, a spatial placeholder for religious and political otherness. It is also necessary to recognize that Jesuit cartography operated within a competitive ecclesiastical environment. Protestant mapmakers, particularly in Northern Europe, produced rival depictions of the world, often emphasizing different regions or attributes. Yet even within these traditions, Tartaria retained a similar cartographic profile. This suggests that the Jesuit influence was not limited to Catholic domains, but permeated broader epistemological norms. The very idea of unclaimed or ungoverned land, ripe for conversion or colonization, was common to both traditions. Thus, while Jesuit doctrine may have shaped the particular contours of Tartaria's representation, the broader geopolitical project was shared across denominational lines. There is also the question of suppressed data. Jesuit missionaries often maintained dual records, one for internal ecclesiastical use and another for external publication. The former were typically more detailed, including ethnographic observations, economic assessments, and political analysis. Access to these records was tightly controlled. If information surfaced suggesting the presence of sophisticated infrastructure, centralized administration, or cultural complexity within Tartaria, such data may have been withheld from publication. The public maps, sanitized and abstracted, would then serve to obscure rather than illuminate the realities on the ground. The extent to which this suppression was deliberate remains difficult to prove conclusively. However, the pattern aligns with known practices of knowledge management within the Catholic Church. Throughout the early modern period, the Vatican exerted control over the dissemination of scientific and geographic information, particularly when it intersected with theological boundaries. Indexes of prohibited books, censorship boards, and doctrinal reviews ensured that maps did not challenge ecclesiastical authority. In this regulatory environment, Tartaria's ambiguous status became a strategic asset. It allowed the Church to acknowledge a geographic presence without granting it historical or theological legitimacy. A further layer of complexity arises when considering the Jesuit influence on historiography. Many early European histories of Asia were compiled from missionary reports, blending religious narrative with empirical observation. In these texts, Tartaria was often described in vague or pejorative terms, barbarous, desolate, or uncivilized. Such descriptions contrasted sharply with the empirical details found in the maps themselves. This dissonance points to an underlying tension. The visual representation of Tartaria acknowledged its scope, but the written narratives worked to diminish its value. This duality facilitated a quiet cognitive dissonance in European thought, seeing without understanding, naming without knowing. The Jesuit contribution to this dissonance cannot be understated. Their maps, while technically impressive and widely circulated, embedded a conceptual architecture that minimized Tartaria's relevance. They did not fabricate the region, but they framed it in such a way that it could be dismissed. The result was a legacy of representation that bore the marks of both inclusion and exclusion. Tartaria was visible, yet systematically neutralized. In summation, the Jesuit role in mapping Tartaria was not one of invention but of filtration. They acted as mediators between local geographies and imperial epistemologies, shaping the terms by which Tartaria entered the European imagination. Their allegiance to doctrine, combined with the strategic imperatives of empire, produced a vision of the world in which Tartaria existed only as a periphery, marked but unexplored, acknowledged but unrecognized. As such, the Jesuit connection reveals not only the mechanics of cartographic suppression, but also the deeper processes by which history itself becomes a tool of theological and political containment. The mystery of Tartaria does not reside solely in its geographical ambiguity, but also in its temporal displacement. In standard historical narratives, Tartaria occupies a vague pre-modern era before being gradually consumed by the Russian Empire and eclipsed by Qing expansion. But within alternative historiography, particularly those critical of conventional chronology, Tartaria is not only a spatial anomaly but a temporal distortion. This line of investigation opens the broader question of whether our received historical timelines are as linear and objective as assumed. The chronology within which Tartaria appears, persists, and disappears may itself be subject to manipulation, omission, or systematic reordering. Addressing this possibility requires analyzing how historical chronology is constructed, standardized, and maintained. The modern timeline of global history is largely a product of European scholarship between the 17th and 19th centuries. Chronological systems such as those of Joseph Scaliger and Dionysius Petavius were not merely mathematical exercises, They were frameworks designed to align biblical events, classical antiquity, and emerging national histories into a cohesive and teleological narrative. This chronology was then institutionalized through education, theology, and encyclopedic publication. But as critics have noted, the sources from which these timelines were derived were fragmentary, regionally inconsistent, and often contradictory. The harmonization of these sources required decisions, some interpretive, others arbitrary, that had lasting consequences for how events were sequenced and understood. In this context, the disappearance of Tartaria coincides suspiciously with the finalization of modern chronology. By the mid-1800s, Western historical timelines had hardened into rigid frameworks taught universally and reinforced through state-sponsored education. Tartaria, which had featured prominently in maps and occasional records before this point, was absent from these timelines. Its cities were unlisted, its rulers unnamed, and its events uncategorized. This silence was not the result of a gradual historical fade, but rather a systemic non-inclusion. The question arises, was Tartaria excluded because it did not fit the emerging chronology, or was the chronology designed in part to exclude anomalous entities like Tartaria? This inquiry finds resonance in the work of scholars such as Anatoly Fomenko, who proposed a radical revision of world history known as the New Chronology. According to Fomenko, vast segments of historical time, from antiquity through the Middle Ages, were duplicated, misdated, or entirely fabricated. His claims, though controversial and often dismissed by mainstream historians, rest on a statistical and textual analysis of historical documents, astronomical records, and genealogical structures. Central to his thesis is the idea that history was not recorded but constructed, assembled to support the political and religious hegemony of dominant institutions, particularly the Catholic Church, and later the European monarchies. Within Fomenko's framework, Tartaria is not a lost fragment but a central casualty of chronological manipulation. He posits that Tartaria was a massive Eurasian empire existing concurrently with, or even as part of, the so-called Roman or Byzantine empires, later rebranded or erased in the official record. According to this model, the traditional boundaries between the classical, medieval, and modern periods collapse. The reordering of events allowed emerging powers to appropriate historical legitimacy while concealing or minimizing the existence of rival civilizations. Regardless of whether one accepts Fomenko's conclusions, the implications for Tartaria are significant. If the construction of time itself is subject to ideological influence, then the exclusion of entire regions or polities becomes not only possible, but probable. The suppression of Tartaria may not be a matter of hiding physical evidence, but of chronologically dislocating it, placing its structures, events, or cultural outputs in time periods where they appear anomalous or disconnected. The result is historical noise, where data exist but cannot be coherently integrated into accepted frameworks. This phenomenon is visible in archaeological inconsistencies across Central Asia and Siberia. Structures of unknown origin, artifacts with unclassifiable styles, and ruins without matching textual references abound in these regions. Yet they are rarely treated as evidence of advanced civilization. Instead, they are attributed to nomadic transients, environmental accidents, or isolated episodes of trade. Their dating is often tenuous, based on stratigraphic assumptions or cross-referencing with European chronologies. Any findings that suggest long-standing, centralized or urbanized activity are quickly assimilated into existing narratives or dismissed as outliers. In doing so, the historical timeline is preserved, but at the cost of explanatory coherence. The problem extends to textual sources. Accounts from travelers, missionaries, and geographers often contain references to powerful or structured societies in regions associated with Tartaria. Yet these accounts are selectively cited, their details minimized or framed as exaggerations. The historical consensus builds not from total evidence but from curated consensus. This consensus is policed through academic peer review, institutional gatekeeping, and archival access. Chronology, presented as objective, becomes a regulatory mechanism defining not only when events occurred, but whether they occurred at all. This control over time is essential to modern state legitimacy. National histories depend on unbroken genealogies, foundational myths, and sacred dates. Inserting a civilization like Tartaria into the historical record would disrupt these narratives. It would require rewriting textbooks, reinterpreting artifacts, and reconfiguring the very flow of historical causality. As such, the exclusion of Tartaria is not merely an academic oversight, but a structural necessity. The official chronology cannot afford its inclusion without unraveling its coherence. Chronological revisionism, then, is not an indulgence in speculation, but a critical method for identifying the boundaries of permissible knowledge. It allows investigators to question not only what happened, but when, and whether the assigned dates serve a political function. In the case of Tartaria, the suspicion is that its temporal displacement allowed for spatial erasure. Removed from the timeline, it faded from the map. Its ruins, cities, and systems, if they remain, are now interpreted through lenses that cannot acknowledge their original context. The chronology wars are thus more than academic debates. They are battlegrounds over cultural memory and civilizational identity. Whether one accepts radical models or not, the existence of credible challenges to the timeline demands a reassessment of how history is constructed. Tartaria may or may not have been an empire, but its ghost remains, embedded in maps, scattered in ruins, and silenced in timelines. Until chronology itself becomes an object of critique, the mystery of Tartaria will remain unsolved, not because it cannot be known, but because it is not permitted to exist within the architecture of official time. The question of whether Tartaria was a geopolitical fiction or a forgotten civilization cannot be resolved through cartographic scrutiny alone. To probe deeper, one must assess material remains, the physical artifacts and infrastructural anomalies that suggest the existence of large-scale societal organization beyond what is recorded in conventional history. Across Eurasia, particularly, in regions previously designated as part of Tartaria, lie vast architectural remnants whose origin, function, and chronology remain uncertain. These structures, fortified complexes, megalithic foundations, monumental gates, underground networks, and geometrically precise urban layouts have frequently been misclassified, misdated, or assigned to civilizations with dubious historical linkage. The investigation into their possible Tartarian origin raises profound questions about civilizational attribution and historical displacement. One of the most telling indicators of civilizational complexity is the presence of coherent infrastructure. Roads aligned to cardinal directions, canal systems that manipulate large-scale hydrology, and energy-intensive constructions such as vaulted domes, columned halls, or integrated sewer systems point to centralized planning and knowledge transfer. Yet across large swaths of Central Asia, Siberia, and even portions of Eastern Europe, such features exist without corresponding narrative in mainstream historiography. When they are acknowledged, they are usually described as isolated innovations, remnants of local dynasties or imitations of better-known civilizations such as the Persian, Mongol, or Chinese empires. This attribution often lacks hard evidence and is built on analogy rather than forensic investigation. Take, for example, the pattern of anomalous megastructures found in the Russian Far East and Central Asian highlands. Some of these formations defy local resource availability, requiring quarrying, transport, and placement of stones weighing several tons over considerable distances. Traditional explanations struggle to reconcile such feats with the presumed technological limitations of the time and region. No coherent labor systems, logistical networks, or administrative records exist in the official histories to account for the execution of these structures. The artifacts remain, but their builders are absent, written out of the script or never entered into it. Equally perplexing are the symmetrical urban layouts uncovered in regions like Tobolsk, Omsk, and Irkutsk, formerly labeled on older maps as cities of Tartaria. These cities exhibit orthogonal street grids, radial planning, and consistent proportional scaling that suggest not organic growth but centralized architectural vision. In many cases, these features predate Russian expansion into the region, yet they are now retroactively ascribed to Tsarist urban development. Archival documentation often fails to support these claims, and there exists a noticeable gap between the supposed builders and the complexity of the construction. Bridges constructed with cyclopean masonry, large-scale star forts whose angles match principles of sacred geometry, and underground tunnel networks connecting distant sites raise additional suspicions. The repetition of specific structural patterns across geographically disconnected areas implies either a shared architectural canon or a single civilizational impulse. The mainstream response is typically diffusionist, suggesting that design ideas spread through trade or military conquest, but this model presupposes a network of interconnection that is not substantiated by the written record. It assumes cultural contact without evidence of the institutions that would have facilitated it, guilds, academies, or administrative centers. More confounding still are the technological traces embedded in the design. Structural reinforcement techniques that rely on harmonic resonance, ferrocement applications that mimic modern engineering, and alignment with solstitial markers suggest not only aesthetic intention but functional sophistication. Such indicators are often dismissed as anachronistic speculation, yet they persist, unexplained, unexamined, and often literally buried under later renovations. The possibility that these remnants belong to a high-functioning society excluded from mainstream historical timelines cannot be ignored. It demands forensic analysis unencumbered by chronological assumptions. The issue of scale also becomes pivotal. If these structures were isolated, they could be classified as curiosities, but their frequency and distribution suggest systematization. The alignment of star forts with longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates, their recurrence near river deltas, or elevated defensive positions, and their consistent size across continents point toward civilizational intent. Tartaria, as it appears in speculative historiography, fits the profile. A widespread, technologically advanced empire with architectural coherence, infrastructural mastery, and geopolitical influence across the Eurasian landmass. Critics argue that assigning such structures to Tartaria is speculative, even irresponsible. But their counter-arguments often rest on silence, on the absence of written proof, rather than the presence of disqualifying evidence. When asked who built these cities, paved these roads, or excavated these subterranean chambers, official narratives retreat into generalized claims, local tribes, expanding empires, or spontaneous communal effort. These explanations do not match the technical demands of the observed infrastructure. They rely on conjecture, supported by historiographical inertia, rather than documented reality. The deliberate concealment or repurposing of these structures further complicates matters. Many older buildings with inexplicable features, arched basements, energy domes, or vacuum-sealed interiors, have been renovated into religious institutions, administrative offices, or military compounds. These reassignments erase their original function and obscure their provenance. The architectural skins remain, but their interior logic is lost. Sometimes entire floors are buried, entrances blocked, or facades altered to remove inscriptions or symbology inconsistent with modern classifications. This process of architectural erasure mirrors the textual erasure already documented in previous sections. It is also instructive to note the linguistic patterns associated with these structures. In many cases, the original names of the buildings, districts, or engineering features have been lost or replaced. The new nomenclature aligns with imperial or nationalist themes, divorcing the objects from their original context. This cultural amnesia, whether intentional or circumstantial, reinforces the erasure. Without a name, there is no narrative. Without a narrative, there is no claim. The buildings become mute relics disconnected from their origin, yet still standing, testifying to an invisible author. The implications of acknowledging a civilizational scale for Tartaria are profound. It would require a reclassification of numerous historical artifacts, a redating of infrastructural remains, and a re-examination of the assumed limits of pre-modern engineering. It would also compel historians to question the authority of their sources and the completeness of their methodologies. Tartaria, in this view, is not a myth to be disproven, but a hypothesis to be tested, a frame for reconciling anomalies that mainstream history has no capacity to accommodate. The evidence does not speak for itself. It must be interpreted, but interpretation without institutional pressure, without chronological constraints, and without political oversight yields a different picture, one in which Tartaria is not an implausible relic, but a plausible absence. A civilization erased not by time, but by historiographic architecture. A society buried not under sediment, but under silence. The investigation into Tartaria increasingly confronts not contradictions within the official record, but its glaring silences. Unlike fabricated myths or pseudo-historical fantasies that can be readily refuted through documentation, Tartaria's problem lies in the consistent absence of engagement by modern academia despite overwhelming cartographic and architectural indications of its former conceptual presence. This phenomenon, where an entity once depicted with consistency is later omitted without formal revision or scholarly rebuttal, demands focused examination. How is it that a territory once dominating maps for centuries is now nearly non-existent in historical archives, encyclopedias, and institutional discourse? The silence is not subtle. Leading historical databases, digital library repositories, and academic curricula contain almost no mention of Tartaria beyond its brief classification as an antiquated term for parts of Central Asia. This classification is repeated without elaboration. No peer-reviewed articles challenge or analyze the process of its disappearance. No doctoral theses track its historiographical decline. When modern scholarship does acknowledge Tartaria, it is either in passing or in a footnote referencing archaic geography. Such avoidance is disproportionate to the volume of visual and textual references that previously affirmed its existence. This raises a critical question. Is the absence the result of historiographic refinement, or is it the product of a strategic omission? Standard academic rebuttals rest on the assumption that Tartaria was never more than a European mislabeling of disparate steppe peoples, but this interpretation relies heavily on etymological reductionism rather than empirical evaluation. The label Tartar or Tatar did indeed derive from Mongol and Turkic influences, but the consistent usage of Tartaria as a coherent territorial identity across centuries and languages suggests more than a semantic error. The disappearance of Tartaria from historical narrative lacks a methodological closure. There is no publication or historiographic event that declares it obsolete, no moment of critical revision that reclassifies it definitively. The name simply vanishes from use, and with it, an entire body of referential data. The mechanisms of archival suppression are subtle and distributed. Textbooks follow academic consensus, which in turn is guided by peer-reviewed institutions that define the limits of admissible inquiry. When an area like Tartaria is systematically excluded from conferences, funding calls, and editorial opportunities, it disappears not because it is disproven, but because it cannot be discussed. This structural omission is reinforced by a tendency in modern historiography to avoid topics lacking dense documentary trails. If an entity left no legal records, no royal charters, and no canonized literature, it is assumed to be culturally insignificant. Tartaria, having left behind infrastructural ruins and map annotations rather than formal administrative archives, is dismissed not on the basis of evidence, but on the absence of a particular type of evidence. This evidentiary bias is further compounded by the authority of European archival institutions, which dominate the preservation and interpretation of historical sources. National libraries, academic presses, and international consortia privilege Western epistemological frameworks, often rendering non-Western data invisible or unreliable. In this environment, a civilization like Tartaria, assuming it maintained oral traditions, localized records, or unconventional systems of administration, would be categorically illegible. Its traces would be filtered out during the archival selection process, treated as noise in the signal of official history. Thus, what survives is not a reflection of what was, but a reflection of what could be institutionalized. One must also consider the effects of imperial conquest on archival continuity. As the Russian and Qing empires expanded into Tartarian territories, they implemented policies of cultural assimilation and bureaucratic homogenization. Local languages were displaced, indigenous knowledge systems dismantled, and pre-existing records either destroyed or translated into new, state-sanctioned forms. This transformation erased original contexts and restructured historical memory according to the needs of central authority. The result is that even if Tartaria once possessed internal documentation, much of it would have been eradicated or absorbed into frameworks that eliminated its autonomy as a category. Even modern digital knowledge systems reinforce the silence. Online encyclopedias, academic search engines, and educational platforms echo the same sparse definitions, often repeating one another in recursive citation loops. The Wikipedia entry on Tartary, for example, categorically refers to it as a historical misnomer without providing analysis of the process by which this consensus was reached. Google Scholar and JSTOR yield little beyond perfunctory references. This feedback loop creates the illusion of consensus, which then deters new inquiry. A graduate student proposing research into Tartaria risks being labeled fringe. A publisher reviewing a manuscript on the topic questions its academic merit. A conference panel avoids inclusion to maintain reputational rigor. The suppression becomes self-sustaining. There are also legal and institutional pressures that limit the dissemination of counter-historical narratives. Museums, universities, and funding bodies have mandates to protect the integrity of national and civilizational stories. These mandates, though rarely explicit in policy, are culturally enforced. Works that challenge dominant historiographies face informal censorship, grants are denied, appointments are not renewed, and publications are marginalized. In such an environment, even raising the Tartaria question becomes an act of reputational risk. Silence, in this case, is not merely passive. It is enforced through structures of authority and professional survival. The silence of the sources surrounding Tartaria, then, is not accidental. It is symptomatic of a deeper flaw in historical methodology, the inability or unwillingness to accommodate high-volume data points that lack sanctioned interpretation. Maps, ruins, oral legends, and architectural anomalies are not absent. They are present in abundance. What is absent is the institutional will to correlate them into a framework that permits the legitimacy of Tartaria as a historical subject. This is not a problem of insufficient data, but of insufficient discourse. The boundaries of academic acceptability have been drawn so narrowly that entire civilizations may vanish without being discredited, only by being disallowed. In many ways, Tartaria's absence is its most powerful presence. Its systematic erasure reveals the blind spots of the institutions tasked with preserving memory. Its invisibility exposes the scaffolding of curated consensus. The academic refusal to engage with Tartaria on investigative terms, preferring dismissal over scrutiny, betrays the limits of a historiography that conflates absence of proof with proof of absence. Until this methodological myopia is acknowledged, the silence will persist, not because the data has failed to appear, but because it has failed to conform. Having established the presence of Tartaria in maps, the material implications of its civilizational infrastructure, and its erasure from modern institutional memory, the investigation must now confront a fundamental question. What happened to Tartaria? Was it destroyed by an identifiable historical catastrophe, natural or man-made, or was it systematically erased through geopolitical reclassification, narrative restructuring, and institutional silence? The answer may lie not in a singular event, but in a convergence of forces that collectively redefined the epistemic space in which Tartaria could exist. These forces include imperial conquest, environmental upheaval, epistemological shifts, and archival suppression, each operating with different intensities across time and geography. One hypothesis posits that Tartaria was subjected to cataclysmic destruction, possibly by natural disaster. Earthquakes, floods, volcanic eruptions, or even climate shifts are frequently cited in alternative historiography as explanatory mechanisms. The 19th century phenomena, sometimes referred to as the mud flood, have become central in speculative circles. These accounts describe widespread layers of compacted mud found in the lower levels of buildings across various cities in Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and even parts of North America. Windows below street level, bricked-in doors, and architectural anomalies inconsistent with official construction dates are interpreted by proponents as evidence of a global deluge event that may have buried entire cities, necessitating reconstruction atop ruined foundations. Mainstream archaeology explains these features through urban stratification, changes in grading practices, or sediment accumulation over time. However, the frequency and distribution of these anomalies suggest that if they were isolated phenomena, they would not recur with such architectural regularity. Moreover, the documentation of full floors buried under meters of compacted earth without corresponding historical accounts of such transformations adds weight to the theory that some kind of large-scale environmental catastrophe occurred, but was either poorly recorded or deliberately omitted. If Tartaria was indeed the civilizational matrix underlying these now buried layers, the physical evidence of its infrastructure may lie beneath the surface, literally concealed rather than metaphorically erased. Another line of inquiry focuses on conquest and suppression. The expansion of the Russian Empire across Siberia, the movements of Qing forces in Inner Asia, and the increasing involvement of Western military and commercial interests in the region during the 18th and 19th centuries represent a prolonged period of political absorption. Tartaria, if functioning as a loosely federated empire or decentralized civilization, may have lacked the centralized military organization needed to resist multiple encroachments. The conquest would not have needed to be overtly genocidal. Instead, it could have occurred through incremental annexation, strategic co-optation of local elites, and disruption of trade routes. Over time, these incursions would have dissolved civilizational cohesion, rendering Tartaria vulnerable to reclassification by external powers. Once fragmented politically, Tartaria would have been vulnerable to narrative overwrite. The conquerors, in asserting legitimacy over newly acquired territories, would have implemented new taxonomies of space and governance. The Qing incorporated regions under the banners of Xinjiang and Manchuria, while the Russian Empire reclassified vast lands as Siberia or the Far East. These names, now normalized in international discourse, function as containers that replace and displace earlier identities. The transformation is not merely semantic. By introducing new place names, architectural programs, and administrative systems, the conquerors effectively destroyed the epistemological continuity of the previous civilization. Tartaria, even if not obliterated physically, ceased to exist in the conceptual framework of the newly imposed order. This transformation is mirrored in cultural displacement. Languages associated with Tartarian regions were either eradicated or absorbed into larger linguistic frameworks. Religious practices were banned or syncretized, rituals outlawed, and symbolic structures repurposed. Oral traditions were left unrecorded, and indigenous knowledge systems were dismissed as folklore. This pattern is consistent with known strategies of imperial assimilation, particularly in frontier regions where cultural identities had not yet been codified into durable textual records. Tartaria's lack of archival footprint in modern terms may thus reflect not its historical non-existence, but its targeted obsolescence. A third explanatory vector involves epistemological change. The Enlightenment and the subsequent rise of empiricism redefined what counted as legitimate knowledge. Civilizations not documented through state bureaucracy, written law, or institutional scholarship were downgraded in status. The very tools used to construct historical reality, chronology, cartography, archaeology, were reoriented to favor centralized, document-heavy civilizations like Rome, Greece, and China. Tartaria, possibly decentralized or reliant on oral governance, would have failed to qualify under these new metrics. Its exclusion was thus not a discovery of error, but a consequence of recalibration. The tools changed, and so did the results. What could not be measured in the new framework was discarded regardless of prior representations. The confluence of these vectors, catastrophic disruption, imperial conquest, and epistemic realignment, created a scenario in which Tartaria could be both physically dismantled and conceptually nullified. It was not a sudden disappearance, but a progressive corrosion. The civilization may have survived in fragments, local traditions, architectural forms, or ethnic identities, but without the unifying designation of Tartaria, these fragments were absorbed into surrounding narratives. The parts remained, but the whole was lost. It is essential to recognize that the possibility of a civilizational collapse does not preclude intentional erasure. On the contrary, the two processes often coincide. A weakened or fragmented society becomes easier to overwrite. Its history can be rewritten, its monuments reassigned, its people renamed. This is not theoretical conjecture, it is a historical pattern. From the destruction of Carthage to the assimilation of the Etruscans, powerful cultures have been eliminated both physically and narratively. What distinguishes Tartaria is that it left behind so many indicators of former prominence, maps, ruins, and infrastructural anomalies, yet triggered no major historical account of its fall. This absence of a collapse narrative is itself an anomaly. There is no accepted history book that tells of Tartaria's defeat, no chronicle that records its last ruler, no treaty that marks its dissolution. This is not merely strange, it is unprecedented. All major civilizations, regardless of how they ended, have some closing chapter. The lack of one for Tartaria suggests not a lack of significance, but a lack of allowance. The civilization was not merely forgotten, it was removed from the domain in which its memory could be articulated. In the final analysis, what happened to Tartaria may never be fully answered through conventional means. The data is too fragmented, the institutions too entrenched, the narratives too stabilized. But the very fact that Tartaria once existed as a dominant cartographic entity and now survives only as a footnote in historical discourse demands an explanation. Whether through catastrophe, conquest, or epistemic violence, a civilization disappeared, not only from the earth, but from the story of the earth. This disappearance is not just a loss of a name, but a loss of an entire ontological category, a way of being, organizing, and knowing that was eliminated without memorial. In recent years, the term Great Reset has come to describe more than economic or political restructuring. Within alternative historical discourse, it refers to the hypothesis of a deliberate, large-scale reorganization of civilization's physical, cultural, and epistemological foundations. The theory proposes that sometime between the 17th and 19th centuries, a cataclysmic event, whether natural, engineered, or hybrid, disrupted the existing global order, erased the memory of previous high civilizations such as Tartaria, and initiated a systematic rebuild of historical chronology, architectural attribution, and technological development. Though dismissed by conventional historians, the Great Reset hypothesis presents a cohesive narrative structure for explaining a broad range of anomalies: architectural inconsistencies, buried city layers, sudden shifts in cartographic conventions, and the abrupt standardization of history under Eurocentric regimes. This section examines the plausibility, internal logic, and implications of such a hypothesis in the context of Tartaria's disappearance. The hypothesis is built on several observable patterns. First, the physical evidence: cities with older levels buried under compacted earth, suggesting they were either abandoned or reconstructed atop ruins. Photographic records from the 19th century frequently show excavation-like environments in urban centers: half-buried windows, doors several feet below the current street level, and widespread rebuilding efforts with ambiguous timelines. These features are globally distributed but most concentrated in regions historically associated with Tartaria. Second, the chronological compression. Major architectural works dated to the 18th or 19th century appear inexplicably sophisticated given the supposed technological state of their builders. Massive railway terminals, palatial government buildings, and intricate cathedral complexes emerged across Russia, Central Asia, and parts of North America in time frames that defy logistical, economic, and technological plausibility within official timelines. The implication is that these structures were not entirely constructed during the dates assigned to them, but were either inherited, unearthed, or repurposed. The theory posits that the post-reset powers, emerging states and empires, found themselves occupying the remnants of a prior civilization. Unable or unwilling to acknowledge this, they reattributed the structures to their own engineers, applying anachronistic historical contexts that fail to match the actual sophistication of the architecture. This would explain the existence of large, highly engineered buildings in relatively undeveloped towns, inconsistencies in construction records, and the recurrent presence of architectural motifs that lack local precedent or continuity. Another critical component of the Great Reset hypothesis is the role of world's fairs and international expositions held in the 19th and early 20th centuries. These events showcased massive temporary buildings allegedly constructed within months, often featuring grand domes, colonnades, and monumental scale. Official narratives describe these structures as ephemeral, built of plaster and wood, and dismantled after the events, but photographic and journalistic evidence shows some of them were built of stone, brick, and steel. Furthermore, logistical records, manpower, raw material acquisition, transportation are inconsistent or absent. The hypothesis argues that these expositions were not exhibitions of progress, but controlled unveilings of repurposed Tartarian structures temporarily open to the public under a new civilizational banner before being destroyed or permanently rebranded. the standardization of history following the purported reset is also central to the hypothesis. The late 19th century witnessed the rise of institutional historiography, national archives, educational standardization, and global chronological synchronization, coinciding with the emergence of photography, mass printing, and state-controlled education. It was during this period that the term Tartaria vanished from maps and encyclopedias. This convergence suggests an intentional narrative reset, a suppression of the old world and the imposition of a revised global past. Notably, this restructuring unfolded across multiple empires with minimal recorded resistance or critical reflection. The seamless adoption of new historical narratives, institutional calendars, and architectural attributions indicates not a gradual evolution, but a directed transition. Critics of the Great Reset hypothesis argue that these claims are based on selective readings, speculative logic, and circumstantial correlations. Yet the counter-arguments rarely address the cumulative anomalies in totality. Instead, they isolate each inconsistency: buried buildings, rapid construction claims, cartographic shifts, and offer conventional explanations without confronting the broader pattern. The hypothesis, while lacking a singular smoking gun, gains weight through aggregation. The recurrence of misaligned timelines, inconsistent documentation, and architectural orphanhood across different regions cannot be dismissed as coincidence indefinitely. Another dimension of the reset narrative involves population displacement and the rewriting of ethnic and linguistic history. Massive movements of people during the 18th and 19th centuries, documented under terms such as settler colonialism, internal migration, and resettlement programs, are interpreted within this framework as not just expansionist projects but mechanisms for replacing or erasing residual Tartarian populations. The depopulation of vast rural areas, the construction of new cities on old foundations, and the violent suppression of cultural minorities all point toward a deliberate obfuscation of pre-reset demographics and traditions. Further supporting this interpretation are the patterns of technology suppression. According to the hypothesis, knowledge systems inherited from Tartaria, particularly in energy, magnetism, and architectural resonance, were gradually suppressed and replaced with fossil fuel-driven industrial models. This transition was not merely technical but ideological. It allowed emerging power structures to monopolize energy systems, centralize production, and engineer economic dependencies. Proponents cite the early cancellation of wireless energy experiments, the disappearance of pneumatic tube infrastructure, and the abrupt pivot away from magneto-mechanical systems as indicative of a broader erasure of pre-reset knowledge. At its core, the Great Reset hypothesis proposes that the world we inhabit is not the product of uninterrupted progress, but the successor to a catastrophe and cover-up. Tartaria, within this narrative, represents the apex of the lost civilization, a global or transcontinental network that maintained high architectural, technological, and perhaps even energetic sophistication. Its erasure was not incidental, but essential for the construction of a new order predicated on industrial capitalism, centralized governance, and controlled history. The hypothesis reframes the silence surrounding Tartaria not as an absence of evidence, but as the result of a deliberate epistemic severance. Even if this reset did not occur as dramatically as proposed, the patterns it identifies are undeniable. The sudden collapse of certain historical designations, the coordinated emergence of new civilizational narratives, and the erasure of anomalous infrastructures all suggest that history is not a passive record, but an active project. Whether by flood, war, or institutional design, something was reset. The question remains, what was erased in the process, and why? Among the most persistent architectural anomalies associated with the Tartarian hypothesis are the so-called star forts, polygonal bastions with radial symmetry, moat systems, and geometrically complex foundations found scattered across Europe, Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Officially, these structures are attributed to Renaissance military engineering, particularly the development of bastion fortifications to resist cannon fire. They are often linked to Vauban-style military reforms and described as defensive strongholds, constructed between the 15th and 18th centuries. However, the scale, distribution, geometric sophistication, and, crucially, the lack of verifiable construction documentation for many of these forts raise questions that exceed their presumed historical purpose. Within the Tartaria framework, star forts are not merely defensive structures, but remnants of a lost architectural and energetic system built upon principles of sacred geometry and planetary alignment. The first anomaly lies in the global dispersion of star forts. While their origin is said to be European, their appearance in places as far-flung as India, Morocco, Japan, and North America defies the conventional diffusionist narrative. Star-shaped citadels with similar structural patterns, multi-pointed bastions, inner courtyards aligned to cardinal directions, and subterranean water regulation systems appear in cities that had minimal or no architectural lineage connected to European military theory. Many of these forts predate colonial influence in their regions or are situated in areas that, according to traditional history, lacked the logistical infrastructure to support such sophisticated construction. A second issue emerges from the lack of construction records. While many forts have dates carved into stones or plaques indicating their presumed completion, actual blueprints, supply chains, or work logs are often missing. This is particularly striking given the claimed time frame of construction during the Enlightenment and early modern periods, eras known for bureaucratic detail, military bookkeeping, and architectural documentation. In many cases, star forts appear to have existed prior to their alleged builders arriving, occupying powers frequently modified or repurposed them, but there is scant evidence of initial construction. This reuse pattern is consistent with the broader theme of architectural inheritance rather than creation, aligning with the notion that later empires absorbed the remnants of a pre-reset civilization. The geometric structure of these forts further complicates conventional explanations. The uniformity of angles, the radial symmetry, and the inclusion of elements consistent with principles of sacred geometry suggest a design philosophy that exceeds mere defense. In several cases, the fort's layout aligns with astronomical markers, equinoxes, solstices, or lunar phases indicating cosmological knowledge embedded within their architecture. Moreover, many star forts include central cores that appear more symbolic than functional, lacking purely military purpose. Their orientation toward celestial poles or magnetic north further implies that these were not simply gunnery positions, but part of a larger energetic or cosmographic system. One hypothesis within the Tartaria framework is that star forts functioned as energy management hubs designed to harness, regulate, or distribute etheric or electromagnetic energy. Proponents cite the use of domes, water channels, and piezoelectric materials like quartz-laden stone as indicative of technologies unknown or suppressed in the post-reset era. The moats surrounding many star forts, often dismissed as defensive features, may have served to channel water as a conductor, creating electro-hydraulic effects or resonance fields. The consistency with which these features appear, even in forts constructed on elevated terrain far from any real military threat, supports the theory that their function extended beyond warfare. Critically, this view is not contradicted by mainstream history so much as it is ignored. Historians typically accept that star forts were based on geometrical design, but attribute it solely to the needs of early modern ballistics and line-of-sight defense. However, this does not account for the symbolic intricacy, the lack of fortifications, In several cases where no battles ever occurred, or the monumental labor involved in constructing these patterns when simpler forms would suffice. In many instances, forts exist in cities of negligible military importance, yet display more elaborate design than major strategic centers. Additional support for the energetic hypothesis arises from early scientific literature and esoteric traditions. Treatises from pre-Enlightenment Europe and the Islamic Golden Age often refer to cities as microcosmic representations of cosmological order. The mandala-like form of star forts reflects this philosophical lineage. The possibility that such structures were not just military but metaphysical in function opens a field of inquiry that crosses disciplinary boundaries, blending architectural history, geomancy, and alternative energy theories. An intriguing observation is the erasure or degradation of many star forts in the 19th and 20th centuries. Several were dismantled, buried, or repurposed, often under the guise of urban expansion. In cases where the outline remains visible, it is typically from aerial photography or satellite imagery, indicating that their full form was not intended to be perceived from ground level. This aerial perceptibility lends credence to the theory that they were meant to operate or signal from an elevated vantage, either technologically or symbolically. The disappearance of their visibility, and in some cases their entire structure, mirrors the broader theme of Tartarian erasure through spatial reclassification. The use of similar star geometry in religious architecture, cathedrals, synagogues, mosques, further complicates the military-only narrative. Rose windows, vault domes, and floor mosaics incorporate identical angular ratios and motifs. This suggests that the knowledge underpinning star fort design was shared across civilizational domains and applied to both sacred and civil engineering. The theory that such design principles are universal metaphysical archetypes does not preclude functional application. It strengthens the case that such knowledge was deliberately encoded into the built environment. Tartaria, in this framework, represents a civilization that mastered this synthesis of sacred science and urban form. The reluctance of academic institutions to investigate these forts beyond their military designation is part of the broader pattern. Already identified, architectural anomalies are preserved as artifacts, but stripped of their epistemological significance. They are reinterpreted within frameworks that do not allow for high-functioning, pre-industrial societies outside the known canon. In this sense, star forts are not just historical puzzles, they are flashpoints in the conflict between sanctioned knowledge and unpermitted memory. Whether or not one accepts the energetic or sacred geometry interpretation, the anomalies persist. The scale, distribution, consistency, and conceptual depth of star forts remain underexplored in formal literature. Their placement, construction, and lack of verifiable origin place them squarely within the domain of Tartarian residue, material witnesses to a paradigm of spatial knowledge and architectural intelligence that has been omitted from modern historiography. Within the broader Tartaria hypothesis, one of the most contentious claims is the suggestion that the lost civilization possessed a form of advanced, decentralized energy technology, specifically electrical or electromagnetic power systems, predating and in some ways exceeding modern developments. This claim is not supported by any centralized documentation, but arises from a pattern of architectural and technological anomalies found across former Tartarian territories and beyond. These anomalies include buildings with unexplained metal, spires, domes with conductive materials, remnants of buried cable conduits, and symbols associated with electromagnetic phenomena. While mainstream history dismisses such interpretations as speculative, the recurring features in infrastructure, combined with suspicious technological reversals in the 19th century, raise critical questions. Was there a form of energy in use that has been systematically removed from public knowledge? And if so, was its disappearance a consequence of the so-called reset, or the prerequisite for constructing a controllable industrial society. The central architectural motif used to support the free energy thesis is the dome and spire system. Many buildings attributed to the late 18th or early 19th centuries, cathedrals, exposition halls, civic centers, feature tall, needle-like spires capped with metallic ornaments, often situated above large, metal-laced domes. These features resemble components of Tesla's later patents: capacitors, atmospheric collectors, and resonators. Yet the buildings in question predate Tesla's public experiments. Mainstream explanations describe these architectural features as symbolic, ornamental, or religious. But when viewed functionally, the configuration aligns with systems designed to capture or transmit atmospheric electricity, particularly from the ionosphere. The existence of conductive materials such as copper, brass, and even mercury inside domes has been reported in scattered architectural surveys, though this is rarely the focus of academic inquiry. Supporters of the free energy theory argue that these buildings were designed not as passive spaces of worship or governance, but as active nodes in a larger energy grid. The hypothesis posits that cities were once configured around these nodes, forming networks capable of wireless energy distribution, streetlights operating without visible wires, heating systems without centralized furnaces, and fountains with continuous pressurized flow are cited as anecdotal evidence. Historical photographs from the 19th century often show public buildings illuminated before widespread electrification, with no visible wiring infrastructure. Skeptics attribute this to oil lamps or early gas systems, but the inconsistencies remain, particularly in isolated settlements, lacking the logistical capacity for such systems. Further attention has been drawn to the repeated destruction, dismantling, or modernization of these structures during the 20th century. Metallic spires were removed or replaced, domes were filled or structurally altered, and internal copper fixtures were stripped under vague justifications, ranging from fire safety to material reuse. In many cases, the original blueprints of these buildings are missing or were redrawn decades later with substantial changes. The frequency of such architectural alterations, especially during times of geopolitical upheaval, suggests more than coincidence. The result has been the erasure of potential functionality, leaving behind shells that are interpreted solely through aesthetic or symbolic frameworks. The story of Nikola Tesla intersects with this theory in complex ways. Tesla's attempts to develop wireless energy transmission, particularly through his Wardenclyffe Tower, were publicly documented and abruptly curtailed. His archives were seized upon his death and remain partially classified or inaccessible. While mainstream narratives explain the abandonment of Tesla's free energy pursuits as the result of financial difficulties and practical limitations, alternative perspectives suggest deliberate suppression by emerging energy monopolies. These perspectives align with the Tartarian hypothesis in arguing that Tesla was not inventing new technology but rediscovering lost principles. The architectural remnants of Tartaria are framed as evidence of this lost knowledge, reinterpreted through Tesla's partial revival and subsequent silencing. Complementing this theory is the study of antiquitech, a neologism referring to antiquated technology allegedly misunderstood or misrepresented by conventional archaeology. These include objects such as mercury-filled tubes, high-frequency resonators, pneumatic tubes, and mechanical computers found in various excavations or old blueprints. Often dismissed as oddities or misinterpreted tools, these artifacts may represent remnants of a technological paradigm distinct from combustion-driven machinery. If Tartaria did indeed develop such systems, their eradication would have been essential to facilitate the industrial paradigm, dependent on centralized fuel extraction, hierarchical grid control, and monetized energy consumption. Energy monopolization, in the modern world, is intrinsically tied to political and economic power. The transformation of energy from a potentially ambient resource into a commodity extracted, refined, and distributed through narrow channels was foundational to statecraft and capitalist expansion. If an earlier civilization had developed infrastructure to harness energy freely from atmospheric or terrestrial sources, that model would directly threaten the emergent energy regimes of the 19th and 20th centuries. Its suppression would not be accidental, it would be strategic. Another dimension of this debate concerns resonance and frequency. Proponents argue that Tartarian technology may have relied on resonant architecture, structures designed to vibrate at specific frequencies to either transmit energy or create physiological effects. Domes, arches, and vaulted ceilings serve as acoustic amplifiers, but they may also serve as energetic resonators. Such theories find limited support in the fields of cymatics and bioresonance, but have not been extensively explored in mainstream research. The possibility that buildings themselves were energy devices reframes our understanding of public architecture, from passive structures to active technologies. Predictably, this view is met with institutional resistance. Electrical engineering and architectural disciplines are siloed. Their crossover is minimal and largely historical. Few scholars are trained to examine a cathedral as a machine or a city square as a frequency hub. This epistemic compartmentalization ensures that anomalous features remain isolated, curious, but unexplored. The result is a scholarly consensus built on mutually reinforcing silences. Free energy remains uninvestigated not due to lack of evidence, but due to lack of interpretive permission. Critically, the Tartarian free energy hypothesis does not claim that modern technology is inferior in totality. Rather, it challenges the linear assumption that technological development always moves forward. It suggests a rupture, a civilizational regression masked as progress. The transition from decentralized ambient resonant energy systems to coal-fired, grid-dependent infrastructure represents not an evolution, but a replacement. This reframing has significant implications for how we understand not only the past, but also the present trajectory of energy development. What remains today are architectural fossils, buildings that once may have formed the nodes of a global energy web, now miscategorized as religious sites or ornamental constructs. Their original function has been obscured, their components dismantled, and their blueprints rewritten. Whether Tartaria operated a true free energy system remains unproven, but the convergence of anomalous architecture, suppressed technologies, and incoherent narratives surrounding the origin of public infrastructure compels a re-evaluation. Was electricity truly invented in the modern era, or was it inherited, then deliberately obscured, modified, and sold back to a world no longer able to remember how it once worked? If Tartaria once existed as a coherent civilizational entity, then its cultural imprint must have extended beyond architecture and geography into language, myth, and symbolic systems. Language is a principal carrier of identity, memory, and worldview. It encodes not just communication, but cosmology, ethics, and continuity. The disappearance of an entire civilizational language, or a family of them, cannot be dismissed as a byproduct of modernization without addressing the mechanisms of linguistic suppression, reclassification, or outright erasure. This section explores the fragmented linguistic landscape across the Eurasian landmass, particularly in regions once labeled as Tartaria, to identify possible remnants of erased or overwritten languages, dialects, and symbolic systems. The silence of Tartarian language in contemporary philology is not merely curious, it is suspicious. One of the foundational assumptions of historical linguistics is that language families evolve gradually with lineages that can be reconstructed through comparative analysis. Yet across vast tracts of Eurasia, linguistic records are sparse, disrupted, or unclassifiable. Dozens of extinct or moribund languages have been documented in passing by ethnographers, explorers, and missionaries between the 17th and 19th centuries. These languages, spoken in Siberia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, and parts of Eastern Europe, exhibit complex grammar systems, extensive vocabularies, and oral literature traditions, yet were either never fully transcribed or are now housed in inaccessible archives. Many are now labeled as isolates or subsumed into broader families with limited explanation. This pattern suggests not just natural attrition, but epistemic displacement. In many cases, these languages were replaced by imposed lingua francas, Russian, Mandarin, Persian, or Turkish, through systems of schooling, administration, and religious conversion. The process was neither spontaneous nor benign. It followed imperial expansions and was enforced through policies designed to erase local identity. In the Russian Empire, this took the form of Russification. In Qing China, it was Sinicization. In both cases, native languages were degraded, written traditions erased, and oral transmission disrupted. Even where local scripts existed, they were often forcibly replaced with Cyrillic or Latin orthographies, fragmenting intergenerational continuity. The result is that large populations now speak languages that are not historically native and no longer possess the linguistic tools to recall or transmit their former civilizational memory. Several suppressed linguistic systems in these regions exhibit signs of having once carried administrative, technical, or symbolic weight. In the Altai and Yenisei river basins, for example, petroglyphs and early inscriptions reference ideographic writing that has not been successfully decoded, yet displays internal logic consistent with systemic writing. These systems bear little resemblance to known regional scripts and lack any clear line of descent from currently dominant languages. They are usually categorized as proto-writing or decorative, despite evidence that they were used in calendrical, astronomical, or legal contexts. If these scripts belonged to a Tartarian administrative structure, their obliteration would have been a strategic act of civilizational overwrite. Linguistic palimpsests, places where newer languages are layered over older, submerged systems, further support this pattern. In toponymy, one finds thousands of place names across Eurasia that defy etymological derivation from current languages. These names are often retained phonetically, but severed from meaning, producing a map of ghost words that signify historical strata now forgotten. These untranslatable terms are often dismissed as artifacts of oral mutation or chance, but their density and recurrence suggest deeper linguistic residue. Such place names may be linguistic fossils of Tartarian dialects or tongues absorbed without comprehension into the conquering language systems that followed. Religious texts and oral epics further reveal signs of disruption. Indigenous belief systems across Central Asia often reference sky gods, elemental hierarchies, and harmonic principles consistent with a metaphysical worldview encoded in language. These cosmologies were frequently converted, suppressed, or reinterpreted. Through imperial religious frameworks, Orthodox Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, resulting in syncretic practices that retain form but lose content. The surviving chants, songs, and invocations may preserve fragments of an original language system, but without linguistic documentation or scholarly interest, they remain marginalized as folklore. The scholarly disregard for such sources is not a failure of rigor, but a byproduct of the classification system itself. What is not already within a known language family is considered irrelevant to formal linguistics. Complicating the matter is the political nature of language classification. The 19th century European tradition of philology, ostensibly scientific, was deeply entangled with the racial and civilizational hierarchies of the time. Linguistic families were organized in ways that reinforced imperial narratives, Indo-European. Languages were privileged, others were cast as degenerate, primitive, or divergent. Languages with no textual tradition were systematically devalued. This Eurocentric filter ensured that even if Tartarian languages had survived in oral form, they would have been disqualified from scholarly attention unless they could be mapped onto the Indo-European or Altaic frameworks. That they were not integrated suggests exclusion by design rather than oversight. The possibility that Tartarian languages were deliberately destroyed also intersects with the strategic role of printing and textual infrastructure. Many imperial expansions involved the destruction of local libraries, scriptoria, and archival centers. The absence of manuscripts in Tartarian scripts is often taken as evidence of non-literacy, yet the burning or repurposing of such material is a historically common tactic of conquest. What little remains is scattered across obscure museum collections, mislabeled or untranslated. No major academic project has been launched to catalogue or digitize potential Tartarian inscriptions, much less reconstruct a lexicon. This omission is especially stark when compared to the extensive efforts made for other extinct or endangered languages of lesser geographic spread or population base. The silence surrounding Tartarian language is thus an echo of broader systemic erasure. Language is not merely a tool of communication, it is a structure of perception. If Tartaria had a linguistic system, its loss would imply the deletion of a worldview, a metaphysics, and a history. Its speakers, denied the use of their tongue, would be rendered stateless in time, unable to name their ancestors, articulate their science, or perform their rituals. This process does not merely erase knowledge, it erases the very possibility of knowing. What is left, then, are fragments, untranslated inscriptions, unexplained place names, censored linguistic maps, and scattered references in colonial reports to now extinct dialects spoken by tribes that no longer exist. These fragments are not proof of a singular language, but they form a pattern of disruption and suppression. To declare that Tartaria left no linguistic trace is premature. To assume that no trace remains is to ignore the politics of erasure. In the absence of preserved grammar, syntax, or literature, linguistic inquiry into Tartaria may appear futile. But the absence is the point. The silence is not a void, it is a redacted record. Whether the Tartarian language was singular or plural, technical or poetic, oral or written, its removal reflects not natural decay, but enforced rupture. Until this rupture is acknowledged, the question remains open, not merely of what language Tartaria spoke, but of what that language could have allowed its people to remember, to build, and to become. The construction of historical knowledge is not a neutral enterprise. It is guided by institutional processes, ideological incentives, and the centralization of epistemological authority. When examining the disappearance of Tartaria from mainstream history, one must not only consider the absence of material evidence or the suppression of cultural artifacts, but also the mechanisms by which historical narratives are stabilized and defended. Modern historiography, particularly in its post-Enlightenment technocratic form, has functioned not as an open-ended investigation into the past, but as a controlled system for validating particular types of knowledge. This section analyzes the institutional architecture of historical scholarship, identifying how it functions as a gatekeeping mechanism that determines what can be known, published, and remembered. At the core of technocratic historiography lies the principle of empirical validation through archival documentation. This methodology privileges written records, state-sanctioned documents, and traceable chains of citation. While such rigor is essential in filtering spurious claims, it also creates structural blind spots. Civilizations that did not rely on bureaucratic writing systems that were disrupted before being integrated into European academic paradigms, or that were misclassified by early explorers, are rendered effectively invisible. Tartaria, lacking a recognized archive and surviving largely through anomalous maps and unexplained architecture, is one such casualty. Its marginalization is not due to lack of complexity, but lack of institutional compatibility with the dominant methods of validation. Historical departments, archaeological institutions, and academic publishing bodies form a hierarchical apparatus that regulates acceptable inquiry. Research is vetted not only for methodological soundness, but for alignment with consensus narratives. Deviations from these narratives, particularly those that threaten to destabilize canonical sequences or national myths, are flagged as speculative, unfundable, or academically unserious. Graduate students are trained to avoid topics deemed controversial. Tenure is awarded in part based on citation conformity, and grant structures reward projects that reinforce prevailing models. Within this system, Tartaria is not simply omitted, it is structurally excluded. The centralization of academic legitimacy is further entrenched through control over access to archives, peer-reviewed journals, and academic conferences. These domains operate through networks of institutional affiliation and funding compliance. Alternative frameworks, oral histories, anomalous architectural interpretations, or comparative cartographic studies struggle to gain entry into these spaces. Even when published, they are often confined to marginal journals or self-published formats, preventing them from influencing curriculum, policy, or mainstream historical synthesis. This self-reinforcing loop ensures that only evidence which confirms the existing model is integrated, while contradictory or anomalous data is fragmented, dismissed, or ignored. Technocratic historiography also relies heavily on disciplinary compartmentalization. Historians rarely collaborate with architects. Archaeologists do not typically consult geometers. Linguists are siloed from engineers. This disciplinary isolation inhibits cross-referencing that might reveal patterns indicative of a suppressed civilization. In the case of Tartaria, architectural anomalies, unexplained linguistic residues, and irregular cartographic entries are interpreted within their separate domains, never synthesized into a coherent anomaly. This fragmentation serves as an epistemic defense. By disaggregating evidence, the system ensures that no single thread can be followed far enough to challenge the master narrative. Moreover, the rise of digital databases and algorithmic indexing has reinforced this exclusion. Search engines, online archives, and digital libraries prioritize sources based on citation frequency, institutional weight, and standardized metadata. As a result, once a narrative is excluded from the early digital corpus, it becomes increasingly difficult for researchers to access relevant material unless they already know what to look for. Tartaria, having been removed from authoritative encyclopedias and reference works by the early 20th century, was never properly digitized into the academic web. It exists, if at all, on the margins, outside the institutional filter bubble that defines scholarly reality. This filtration system is compounded by ideological inertia. Academic historiography is not only driven by empirical discovery, but by the need to maintain coherence with the philosophical assumptions of modernity, linear progress, Enlightenment rationality, and European centrality. The existence of a forgotten or erased empire such as Tartaria would threaten these pillars. It would imply non-linear technological development, non-Western knowledge systems equal or superior to modern standards, and the possibility that history is not cumulative, but selective. Such implications are intolerable to a system built on the legitimacy of its own continuity. As such, evidence of Tartaria must not only be ignored, it must be rendered unthinkable. Even alternative history, when permitted into academic discourse, is often tolerated only insofar as it can be neutralized. Topics such as the Sea Peoples, Göbekli Tepe, or the Bactrian-Margiana archaeological complex are allowed to challenge minor aspects of chronology or regional interpretation, but are rarely permitted to question the structural coherence of the entire historical record. Tartaria, as a hypothesis, crosses that threshold. It suggests not a revision but a rupture, a past that was deliberately severed, not forgotten, a civilization that did not fail but was erased. This distinction is critical. Historical failure implies natural decline, conquest, or assimilation. Historical erasure, by contrast, implies agency, motive, and strategy. Technocratic historiography, in denying the latter possibility, shields itself from accusations of complicity. Yet the pattern is unmistakable. When certain topics, names, or maps are systematically removed without scholarly reckoning, the result is not ignorance, it is narrative control. The academic reluctance to revisit Tartaria is not simply a matter of time constraints or evidentiary gaps. It is the product of a regime of knowledge whose authority depends on narrative stability. Introducing Tartaria would require not only new research but a paradigm shift in how history is validated, taught, and institutionalized. It would demand, admitting that entire civilizations may have been omitted, that timelines are malleable, and that evidence without narrative is insufficient. Such an admission would destabilize not just content, but the framework of historical knowledge itself. In this context, Tartaria is not merely a lost civilization, it is a boundary condition of historiographic legitimacy, a test of whether the current system can accommodate radical uncertainty and structural anomaly. The fact that it cannot or will not indicates the limits of current knowledge production. Until those limits are acknowledged, the disappearance of Tartaria will remain not only unresolved, but officially unmentionable. The disappearance of Tartaria from the historical and geographic record did not end with Western imperial expansion. It continued, arguably intensified, under Soviet rule. As the USSR consolidated control over vast territories once labeled Tartary on pre-19th century maps, it initiated a sweeping cartographic, ethnographic, and cultural overhaul of Central Asia, Siberia, and the Caucasus. The process was not simply one of renaming or administrative reclassification. It involved the systematic deletion, modification, and overwriting of entire geographic and historical categories. Soviet cartography, far from being a passive record of topographical fact, functioned as an ideological instrument, an engine of epistemic sanitization. In the case of Tartaria, the Soviet map erased not only a name, but an entire conceptual space. The first step in this sanitization was the restructuring of regional geography into a series of Soviet socialist republics and administrative oblasts. Ancient place names, many of which survived in local oral traditions or in older maps, were replaced with standardized nomenclature reflecting political functions, such as autonomous republic, oblast, or krai. The vast and varied territories once lumped under Tartaria were fragmented and redistributed among Russia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and portions of Mongolia and China. This fragmentation dissolved any residual cartographic cohesion that may have pointed to a prior unifying identity. By recoding space into Soviet categories, any memory of Tartaria as a contiguous entity was systematically neutralized. Soviet ethnographic policy further enforced this dissolution. Under the banner of korenizatsiya, indigenization, local ethnic groups were encouraged to develop national identities, but only within narrowly defined frameworks sanctioned by the state. Dozens of distinct groups were assigned languages, flags, and historical narratives in a top-down fashion, often drawing arbitrary distinctions or erasing existing cultural continuities. In this way, any potential memory of a shared Tartarian past was replaced by atomized national identities, each too small and politically dependent to sustain independent historical inquiry. The central state retained control of all institutional memory, rewriting the past through selective anthropology, controlled publication, and a curated archaeological record. A striking feature of Soviet cartographic production was the existence of multiple layers of maps: civilian, military, and restricted use editions. Civilian maps were often simplified and stripped of sensitive or anomalous data. Features such as ancient ruins, unexplained structures, or pre-modern city layouts were either omitted or relabeled. Military maps, by contrast, often retained detailed information, including geodetic markers, grid coordinates, and annotations on unexplained geographic anomalies. Access to these maps was tightly controlled, and their contents rarely entered public or academic discourse. This bifurcation of geographic knowledge served a dual function. It protected state secrets while ensuring that inconvenient historical questions remained unasked. The treatment of anomalous architecture within Soviet borders also followed a pattern of suppression or reattribution. Buildings with unexplained foundations, non-Russian stylistic elements, or star-fort geometry were retroactively assigned to known periods, typically the Russian imperial or Tsarist eras, without supporting construction records. In many cases, the official narrative presented these structures as products of military engineers during periods of expansion, even when the materials, construction methods, or site orientations contradicted these attributions. Where inconsistencies were too large to ignore, the structures were demolished, repurposed, or fenced off under military jurisdiction. The historical narrative was maintained through removal rather than reconciliation. The Soviet approach to history was governed by dialectical materialism, a philosophy that emphasized progress, class struggle, and the inevitability of socialist triumph. Within this framework, the past was not a neutral field of inquiry but a battlefield of competing narratives. Only those histories that reinforced the Marxist-Leninist model were allowed to persist. Any reference to advanced ancient civilizations, especially those outside the Greco-Roman or Chinese paradigms, was considered suspect, particularly if it challenged the notion of linear technological development or pre-modern egalitarianism. Tartaria, with its implications of suppressed technological sophistication and decentralized sovereignty, was ideologically incompatible with Soviet historicism. The control extended into academia and education. Soviet historians, geographers, and archaeologists were required to adhere to strict ideological guidelines. Research that deviated from the accepted line, whether through questioning of chronology, interpretation of artifacts, or exploration of pre-Russian civilizations, was met with professional penalties, censorship, or worse. Archives were purged or sealed, and access to foreign materials was restricted. This intellectual quarantine ensured that no comprehensive re-evaluation of the region's deep past could emerge from within the system. Even today, many archives from this period remain classified or inaccessible to independent researchers. Another dimension of the Soviet erasure was the control of language and terminology. Words associated with Tartaria, Tartary, Tartar, Great Tartary were systematically removed from print, excised from maps, and relabeled in dictionaries. Encyclopedic entries were edited or deleted. Public usage of these terms declined sharply, and by the mid-20th century they had become all but extinct in academic and governmental discourse. The silence was not passive, it was programmed. A historical term that had once dominated European maps and travel accounts vanished in a few generations without a trace of official reckoning. Satellite imagery and declassified Soviet military maps now provide limited opportunities to re-examine the suppressed geography. Researchers have identified geometric anomalies, buried city grids, and inexplicable alignment patterns across Central Asia and Siberia, features that match pre-modern urban design far more than Soviet planning. Some of these anomalies correspond to locations labeled on 17th and 18th century maps as cities or regions of Tartaria. Their absence from Soviet-era documentation suggests not loss by time, but active removal from the geographic record. The Soviet sanitization of Central Asia's deep past serves as a case study in how modern regimes engineer historical memory. The tools were not only tanks and treaties, but maps, encyclopedias, curricula, and classification systems. The disappearance of Tartaria under Soviet rule was not the outcome of better information, but the outcome of more effective narrative control. It illustrates how power does not merely redraw borders, it redraws time. In the broader investigation of Tartaria, Soviet cartography represents the final seal on the archive, a geopolitical and epistemological closure that converted an ambiguous past into a forbidden one. What was once visible, even celebrated on maps and in writings across continents, became unprintable. The questions were not answered, they were unasked. And until that seal is broken, Tartaria remains not only a missing civilization, but a measure of how deeply the modern world has buried the tools for remembering it. Few figures have provoked more controversy in the modern reassessment of historical chronology than Anatoly Fomenko. A Russian mathematician by training, Fomenko is best known for developing the new chronology, a sweeping and systematic challenge to the foundations of accepted history. His work, which applies statistical, astronomical, and textual analysis to historical sources, argues that the conventional timeline of civilization, spanning thousands of years, is fundamentally flawed. Central to his theory is the idea that many so-called ancient and medieval events were duplicated, redated, or fabricated in later centuries, particularly during the Renaissance and early Enlightenment. In the context of the Tartarian hypothesis, Fomenko's methodology is significant not because it confirms the existence of Tartaria directly, but because it exposes the epistemic vulnerabilities that allow such a civilization to be plausibly erased. Fomenko's critique begins with the assumption that history, as a scientific discipline, lacks an objective calibration. Unlike physics or chemistry, historical data cannot be tested in real time. It relies on documents, artifacts, and interpretations, all of which are susceptible to forgery, misdating, and narrative distortion. Fomenko applies advanced statistical methods, correlation analysis, frequency distribution, and Bayesian modeling to historical chronicles, comparing patterns in textual narratives across supposed centuries and regions. His conclusion is radical. Large segments of world history, including those of ancient Greece, Rome, and Egypt, are composite constructs. They are not false in content but misplaced in time. This has direct implications for the concept of Tartaria. If entire civilizations have been duplicated, erased, or folded into other narratives, then Tartaria's absence from the modern historical record may be a structural artifact of this chronological compression. According to Fomenko, much of what we call ancient history is a reflection of events that actually occurred between the 11th and 17th centuries, with older datings retroactively applied to construct a linear, coherent timeline. Tartaria, if it existed as a high civilization during this compressed era, may have been absorbed into misattributed empires such as the Mongol or Byzantine. Its distinct identity, chronology, and contributions could have been overwritten in the process of synchronizing global history to fit a Eurocentric developmental arc. A core tenet of the new chronology is the identification of phantom duplications, historical events that appear repeatedly under different names in different periods. Fomenko and his collaborators argue that many medieval and ancient rulers are numerical or linguistic variants of the same historical figures. For example, he suggests that Charlemagne, Caesar, and various Tsars represent overlapping biographies retitled and relocated across time. Applied to Tartaria, this suggests that known historical figures such as Genghis Khan or Timur may be misdated or misrepresented avatars of a more centralized, coherent power, possibly Tartarian in nature, whose structure and legacy have been distributed across disparate imperial narratives. The reception of Fomenko's work has been predictably hostile in mainstream academic circles. Historians and archaeologists dismiss it as pseudo-history, citing its lack of conventional peer review, selective data use, and reinterpretation of well-established chronologies. However, what is often overlooked in these critiques is the methodological conservatism of institutional history itself. Fomenko's mathematical approach, while not unassailable, represents an attempt to introduce formal rigor into a field that often relies on interpretive consensus. His rejection is as much about preserving the authority of established narratives as it is about contesting empirical validity. Fomenko's work is also deeply critical of the role played by the Catholic Church, particularly the Vatican, in constructing the historical timeline. He argues that the Gregorian calendar reform undertaken in the late 16th century was not merely a corrective mechanism, but a chronological reset, a way of aligning disparate historical traditions into a single, controllable sequence. This aligns with broader Tartarian themes, that a significant civilizational restructuring occurred during this period, involving both the suppression of existing histories and the retrofitting of new ones. If Tartaria was a powerful entity whose worldview or geopolitical presence challenged Western theological authority, then its disappearance could have been part of this ecclesiastical restructuring. It is worth noting that Fomenko's theories, while popular among certain fringe communities, have gained limited traction in academic institutions. However, his influence is growing among independent researchers, online historical revisionists, and those engaged in alternative archaeology. This is due in part to the accessibility of his arguments. He presents complex mathematical critiques in language that challenges conventional assumptions without requiring esoteric specialization. His work has also been translated into multiple languages and widely disseminated online, bypassing traditional academic gatekeeping. In the context of Tartaria, Fomenko provides a plausible framework for understanding how a civilization could disappear from history, not because it lacked significance, but because its chronology was dismantled. If Tartaria's rise and fall occurred within the misdated centuries that Fomenko identifies, then its integration into competing imperial chronologies, Russia, China, the Islamic caliphates, could have occurred without notice, its autonomy erased by temporal reclassification. Structures attributed to later empires may in fact belong to Tartaria. Events associated with unrelated dynasties may be misdated reflections of Tartarian history. The methodological challenge remains: how does one test a historical theory without relying on the very timelines it seeks to challenge? Fomenko's solution, mathematical, modeling of text frequency, linguistic patterning, and astronomical records, may not provide conclusive proof, but it introduces a level of falsifiability absent in traditional historiography. His work reframes history as a hypothesis to be tested, not a narrative to be defended. This opens space for hypotheses like Tartaria, not as wild speculation, but as testable alternatives that better align with anomalous data. In the final analysis, Fomenko's new chronology may not prove the existence of Tartaria, but it demolishes the methodological arrogance that would dismiss Tartaria a priori. It demonstrates that the construction of historical time is a political and epistemological act, subject to distortion, revision, and suppression. The disappearance of Tartaria may be one such distortion, not a matter of missing data, but of rearranged chronology. Until the framework itself is interrogated, questions like Tartaria will remain unanswerable, not due to lack of evidence, but due to lack of permission to see the evidence in its proper temporal context. While Tartaria was erased from formal historiography and official cartographic records, it has experienced a striking revival in the digital age. This resurgence is not due to the rediscovery of a central archive or a singular archaeological breakthrough, but through the decentralized, participatory, and often anonymous circulation of content across internet platforms. From online forums and image boards to long-form video documentaries and sprawling social media threads, Tartaria has been reconstructed not by institutions, but by distributed digital actors. The rise of Tartaria as a subject of investigation, and in some circles, conviction, is emblematic of a broader crisis of epistemology in the post-industrial West. The collapse of trust in academic authority and the emergence of participatory counter-histories. The digital resurrection of Tartaria began as a fringe phenomenon on platforms such as Reddit, YouTube, and 4chan, where users began compiling anomalies in maps, architecture, and photography that contradicted mainstream timelines. Central to this digital archive were 18th and 19th century maps depicting Tartary, photographic documentation of buildings with ambiguous construction dates, and speculative interpretations of unexplained engineering feats. While initially disorganized and speculative, the conversation quickly became structured. Users began archiving images, geotagging star forts, tracing architectural motifs, and constructing independent timelines. These efforts took the form of collaborative investigations, more akin to open-source software projects than traditional academic research. One of the unique features of the digital Tartaria movement is its use of visual evidence. In contrast to academic history's reliance on text-based documentation, digital researchers privilege visual cues, photo comparisons, architectural similarities, and satellite imagery. Platforms like TikTok and Instagram, often dismissed as trivial, became repositories for highly detailed video breakdowns of alleged Tartarian buildings, complete with 3D reconstructions, speculative blueprints, and walkthrough analyses. These visual arguments bypass textual gatekeeping and appeal directly to intuition and pattern recognition. They also encourage independent verification. A viewer can visit the site, examine the structure, and assess the claims with minimal mediation. The digital context also fosters a unique form of archival recovery. Old books, atlases, and encyclopedias, long out of print and largely ignored, are scanned, uploaded, and circulated in online repositories. Users conduct keyword searches for Tartary, extract excerpts, and place them into crowdsourced timelines. This results in the emergence of an alternative canon, a networked body of data that exists outside institutional archives. While such material lacks formal peer review, it is often drawn from primary sources and assembled with a level of collective scrutiny that rivals academic projects. This creates a dual epistemology, one rooted in professional authority, the other in digital participatory validation. However, the Tartaria digital movement is not homogeneous. It spans a spectrum from meticulous architectural analysis to speculative metaphysics. Some contributors focus on comparative cartography, correlating anomalies across hundreds of historical maps. Others link Tartaria to lost energy technologies, atmospheric ether theory, or esoteric cosmologies. Still others attempt to trace cultural or genetic lineages from alleged Tartarian populations. This breadth is both a strength and a liability. It allows for a holistic exploration of the hypothesis, but it also opens the door to conflation, myth-making, and conspiratorial excess. Critics use the presence of fringe elements to dismiss the entire inquiry, ignoring the fact that serious patterns are being documented beneath the speculative surface. The phenomenon also reveals how digital media have changed the nature of historical inquiry. In the past, narratives were constructed vertically by accredited historians publishing through gate-kept channels. In the digital age, narrative formation is lateral. Thousands of semi-anonymous users gather, interpret, and share fragments of information, creating emergent consensus without central authority. This process mirrors the decentralized structure of Tartaria itself, as hypothesized by its digital historians, a once coherent network now scattered, its remnants being reassembled by those outside the institutions that erased it. What distinguishes the Tartaria resurgence from traditional revisionist history is its self-awareness. Digital content creators often acknowledge the speculative nature of their work, framing it not as definitive truth but as an open inquiry. This epistemic humility contrasts with the rigid certainty often projected by institutional historians. Paradoxically, this humility makes the digital Tartaria movement more dynamic, allowing it to evolve as new evidence or reinterpretations emerge. It operates on a feedback loop, integrating audience responses, cross-disciplinary suggestions, and visual submissions in real time. The resurgence has also drawn institutional backlash. Search engine algorithms were altered to downrank Tartaria-related content. Wikipedia entries were edited or locked to prevent deviation from official narratives. YouTube demonetized videos containing speculative historical themes, citing misinformation policies. These interventions, far from silencing the movement, validated its core suspicion that certain questions are not merely discouraged but actively policed. The attempt to limit discussion inadvertently reinforced the perception that Tartaria's disappearance was not due to irrelevance, but to threat. Despite these pressures, the digital archive of Tartaria continues to expand. It now includes scanned pages of rare maps, architectural catalogues, construction reports, personal travelogues, and local oral histories, all collected and contextualized by independent researchers. Specialized websites, podcasts, and even conference events have emerged, further solidifying Tartaria as an enduring subject of public historical inquiry. Some researchers have begun building digital models of alleged Tartarian cities, integrating GIS data with historical references. Others use AI tools to restore or colorize old photographs, revealing previously unnoticed architectural features. This participatory reconstruction is not equivalent to proof, but it demonstrates the power of digital platforms to restore what institutional systems have neglected or rejected. The Tartaria hypothesis, in its digital form, is less about definitive claims and more about reopening the archive, expanding the boundaries of inquiry to include what was previously considered noise. It exemplifies a new kind of historiography, decentralized, visual, participatory, and suspicious of centralized authority. Whether Tartaria was a real civilization or a collective projection, its digital resurrection exposes a deeper fracture in the modern historical regime. It reveals the inadequacy of official narratives to account for the complexity, inconsistency, and loss embedded in the past. In that sense, Tartaria is not merely a topic of interest, it is a method of critique. It invites us to consider how history is stored, how it is accessed, and who gets to decide what remains visible. In the Internet age, erasure is no longer permanent, and the past, once discarded, may return, rebuilt not by governments or universities, but by networks of those unwilling to forget. The marginalization of Tartaria cannot be fully understood without situating it within the broader epistemological frameworks established by Western imperial powers during their global expansion. From the 15th century onward, Europe's cartographic and historical projects operated not merely to record the world, but to define and dominate it, geographically, temporally, and ontologically. The production of knowledge became inseparable from the exercise of power. As the West mapped, classified, and narrated the world, it constructed spatial hierarchies and civilizational timelines that elevated its own position while relegating others to the periphery. Tartaria, both in how it was once depicted and in how it disappeared, exemplifies this dynamic. A space framed as simultaneously vast and unknowable, significant yet unimportant, always other, At the heart of Western imperial epistemology lies the spatialization of time. Societies not aligned with European political forms or technological systems were not merely distant in space, they were placed earlier in time. This practice, described by scholars as allochronism, allowed colonizers to cast contemporaneous societies as living remnants of Europe's own past. African kingdoms, Asian principalities, and American polities were presented as echoes of medieval or even prehistoric stages of development. This temporal displacement legitimized domination. To rule others was to help them catch up. Tartaria, as a sprawling and undefined territory, was ideal for such treatment. Even when shown on maps, it was rarely integrated into any temporal framework. It remained frozen in an eternal present, outside of history, and thus outside of legitimacy. Cartography, as an imperial tool, played a central role in this epistemological framing. Early modern maps served not only to depict land masses but to encode political narratives. The inclusion or exclusion of names, borders, cities, and ethnographic detail functioned as a form of symbolic control. When Tartaria appeared on these maps, it was often labeled generically Great Tartary, Independent Tartary, with minimal detail despite its size. Its presence was acknowledged, but its complexity was withheld. This allowed Western powers to recognize the land without granting it identity. Later, as empire expanded and global maps were redrawn to reflect colonial possessions and spheres of influence, Tartaria was fragmented, renamed, and ultimately erased. The process was not a discovery of inaccuracy, but a redefinition of admissible space. The same logic applied to historical narrative. The Enlightenment-era universal histories sought to construct a linear global timeline with Greece and Rome at its roots and Western Europe at its apex. Civilizations that could not be linked to this arc were omitted or simplified. Tartaria, lacking integration into this lineage, was framed as peripheral or anomalous, even when it intersected with known events such as Mongol incursions into Europe or Chinese frontier campaigns. It was never granted its own narrative agency. It served as a backdrop to other histories, a staging ground for actions that belonged to others. This narrative function, visible but voiceless, allowed Tartaria to exist as a concept without ever being granted the status of a subject. The ideological foundations of Western historiography reinforced this exclusion. Philosophers such as Hegel explicitly ranked civilizations according to their proximity to the rational state, which he identified with modern Europe. Peoples who lacked centralized bureaucracy, codified law, or monumental architecture were considered ahistorical. Tartaria, assuming it operated through decentralized networks, oral governance, or non-Western urban forms, would have been automatically excluded by these criteria. Its very mode of existence would have disqualified it from being seen as a civilization. The absence of Tartaria from modern historical curricula is not evidence of non-existence, but a reflection of these epistemological filters. Museums and archives further institutionalized this logic. As artifacts were excavated, collected, and displayed, their provenance was interpreted through European taxonomies. Items found in Tartarian regions were often reattributed to known empires, Mongol, Russian, Chinese, regardless of stylistic or material inconsistency. This process of assimilation ensured that even physical evidence, when encountered, was rendered legible only within sanctioned frameworks. Anomalous items were misclassified or placed in miscellaneous categories, effectively neutralizing their disruptive potential. In some cases, entire collections were stored but never displayed, their significance unrecognized under dominant interpretive models. The educational system played a final role in sealing Tartaria's erasure. Textbook standardized narratives for mass consumption, reinforcing linear development models, and fixed civilizational hierarchies. Tartaria, if mentioned at all, was reduced to a footnote, perhaps in the context of the Mongol Empire, or as an archaic term for parts of Siberia. Its former presence on maps was explained as a mistake, and no further inquiry was encouraged. Students were trained not to ask why such a vast region had no detailed history, no remembered cities, no named kings. The silence was normalized. The Western epistemic order is not unique in creating boundaries between self and other, but its global dominance, achieved through technological, military, and economic supremacy, made its classifications nearly universal. Institutions around the world, universities, museums, media, internalized its categories and repeated its exclusions. Tartaria, erased in Europe, remained erased in Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Even scholars from formerly colonized regions learned to reproduce the master narrative, now in their own languages. In this context, the re-emergence of Tartaria in digital discourse is more than a historical curiosity. It is a symptom of the breakdown of Western epistemological authority. As centralized institutions lose control over narrative production, previously excluded concepts re-enter public consciousness. This does not mean they are automatically valid, but it means they can no longer be dismissed without engagement. The return of Tartaria is a return of the repressed, a symbolic challenge to the spatial and temporal hierarchies that have governed modern thought. Critically, this does not imply that all claims about Tartaria are accurate or that skepticism is unwarranted, but it reveals that the criteria by which claims are deemed admissible are themselves political. The question is not simply, did Tartaria exist, but who gets to decide what counts as existence? If the answer remains within the same institutions that erased Tartaria to begin with, then the question has already been foreclosed. The suppression of Tartaria is not a conspiracy in the popular sense. No cabal of historians convened to delete it. It is a structural effect of an epistemic regime that privileges certain forms of knowledge, space, and time. Until that regime is interrogated, the recovery of Tartaria remains not only unlikely, but impermissible. It is not just a matter
of looking harder.
It is a matter of asking who has been permitted to look at all. The debate over Tartaria occupies a liminal space between verifiable history and speculative inquiry. It challenges not only what we believe to be true about the past, but how we determine what qualifies as truth in historical investigation. The entire inquiry, spanning maps, architecture, chronology, language, and digital reconstitution, reveals a tension that sits at the heart of modern historiography, the boundary between what can be demonstrated with material evidence and what is excluded for lack of institutional validation. Tartaria, in this framework, is less a test of factuality than of methodological limits. Its absence from accepted history may not signify falsehood, but a failure of historiographic systems to accommodate high-order uncertainty. Historical certainty is rarely absolute. It is a layered consensus built over time through repeated publication, institutional endorsement, and pedagogical repetition. Events are not confirmed solely through artifacts or documents, but through alignment with prevailing frameworks: chronological, geographical, ideological. An anomaly, even when documented, is typically dismissed unless it can be situated within these established scaffolds. Tartaria violates these expectations. It appears where it should not, in forms that are difficult to reconcile, and in temporal contexts that refuse linear integration. The response is not analysis, but exclusion. This raises a critical question. Is the current historical method capable
of absorbing complex uncertainties, or has it evolved to suppress them?
The dominant model of historical knowledge formation prioritizes corroborated data, textual records, carbon-dated objects, known genealogies, and institutional continuity. This model works well when dealing with literate civilizations that left behind state archives, monumental inscriptions, or archaeological layers matching known eras. But it fails when encountering phenomena that fall outside those patterns, civilizations without paper trails, structures with disputed construction timelines, linguistic isolates without clear parent languages. Tartaria, to the extent that it existed, likely embodied all these traits. It therefore resides in what could be called the epistemic blind spot, visible but not admissible. It is precisely here that myth begins to fill the void left by method. In the absence of stable historical anchoring, the imagination steps in, not necessarily to fabricate but to approximate. Digital reconstructions of Tartarian architecture, speculative energy systems, and reconstructed maps are attempts to make sense of what the academic system has refused to account for. These narratives function mythologically, not because they are invented, but because they are built on unresolved symbolic fragments. They operate in the space where method falters, not to replace it, but to pressure it. This does not mean that all Tartaria-related claims are equal. Some are based on observable, verifiable inconsistencies. Others are extrapolations driven by ideological or mystical motives. The conflation of these strands weakens the inquiry and makes it easier to dismiss, but their coexistence is also a sign of methodological failure. When legitimate questions are excluded from institutional platforms, they resurface in uncontrolled environments, where speculation replaces scrutiny and synthesis replaces precision. The resulting hybrid discourse, part history, part speculation, should not be mocked but understood as a symptom of deeper structural exclusion. Historiography itself is not neutral. It is shaped by funding priorities, ideological commitments, archival access, and academic gatekeeping. What gets studied, what gets preserved, and what gets published is never purely empirical. Methodology, like law, is applied selectively. Entire regions, peoples, and artifacts have been excluded from official history because they do not conform to the accepted scaffolding. Examples abound: oral histories ignored due to lack of transcription, ruins dismissed for not fitting chronological expectations, linguistic patterns rejected due to classification problems. Tartaria joins this list not because it has been disproven, but because it has never been methodologically permitted to exist. This tension reflects a deeper problem. Modern historiography often treats its own categories as self-evident. Civilization is defined by cities, cities by bureaucracy, bureaucracy by writing, and writing by state preservation. But these are not natural laws, they are historiographic choices. A society that operates through oral memory, decentralized authority, and energetic architecture may leave no parchment or tax code. Yet it may still have existed, structured, and persisted. If such a society were then eliminated or assimilated, the absence of conventional markers would make its reconstruction impossible under current methods. Tartaria may be precisely such a case. The insistence on material certainty, while defensible in principle, has become restrictive in practice. It has rendered the field incapable of addressing large-scale anomalies without either dismissing them or reducing them to isolated curiosities. The result is a history that is empirically rich but conceptually narrow, capable of explaining what fits, but not of asking why so much does not. Tartaria, whether it existed in the literal sense or as a misrecognized civilizational complex, forces us to confront this limitation. It is not just a mystery of content, but a failure of form. There is also a temporal blindness in historiography, the assumption that knowledge accumulates and that earlier interpretations are necessarily inferior. But the standardization of historical knowledge in the 19th and 20th centuries may have narrowed inquiry more than it expanded it. The erasure of Tartaria coincides not with new discoveries, but with the institutionalization of history as a modern academic discipline. This temporal coincidence should not be ignored. It suggests that what is remembered is not always what is best known, but what is most useful to the structures doing the remembering. The challenge, then, is not to prove Tartaria's existence as a final fact, but to recognize its persistence as a methodological provocation. It demands a historiography that is comfortable with liminality, with interpretive instability, with the idea that absence may be constructed and that certainty may be political. Until such a model emerges, inquiries like Tartaria's will remain, trapped between myth and method, too structured to be fantasy, too unstructured to be accepted. This in-between space is not unproductive. It is where new questions are born, where disciplinary assumptions are exposed, and where history ceases to be a closed system. Tartaria is not an answer. It is a question that the current method refuses to ask. And in that refusal, it reveals the boundary between what we can know and what we are allowed to know. Tartaria, as explored through cartographic anomaly, architectural residue, temporal dislocation, linguistic erasure, and digital reconstruction, is not merely a lost civilization. It is a conceptual rupture in the architecture of historical knowledge. Whether or not Tartaria existed as a centralized empire, a diffuse cultural network, or a civilizational template fundamentally different from the modern state, its disappearance from formal history constitutes more than a mystery. It functions as a mirror for historiography, a question mark over the assumed continuity of civilizational time, and a catalyst for rethinking the foundations upon which historical legitimacy rests. The investigation has traced Tartaria's presence across early maps and then its progressive exclusion. It has uncovered consistencies in urban geometry, inexplicable infrastructural sophistication, and reattribution of construction that challenge the assigned timelines. The linguistic discontinuities, the suppression of regional identities through imperial conquest, and the standardization of post-reset historical narratives point to deliberate editorial processes, not the natural erosion of collective memory. Every section of this inquiry has returned to the same threshold. Tartaria is not absent due to lack of evidence. It is absent due to a failure of permission, interpretation, and institutional recognition. In this light, Tartaria becomes less an object of recovery and more a framework for critique. It symbolizes the limits of modern historiographical method, the consequences of disciplinary enclosure, and the dangers of over-consolidated epistemic authority. It represents what happens when anomalies are too large to explain and too disruptive to integrate. Its disappearance challenges the neutrality of evidence, the objectivity of timeline construction, and the political neutrality of maps. It forces a confrontation with the constructedness of history itself. Tartaria also embodies the problem of archive, what is stored, what is excluded, and who controls the classification system. If historical legitimacy is tied to written documents, centralized administration, and institutional continuity, then any culture that operated through alternative means, oral transmission, energetic systems, decentralized governance, will be automatically disqualified from historical visibility. Tartaria, if real, may have failed not in its civilization, but in its compatibility with archival norms. Its erasure may thus be epistemological before it is archaeological. The revival of Tartaria in the digital realm illustrates this dynamic reversal. It shows that history, once monopolized by academia, can be reopened by non-institutional actors. Though this reopening carries risks, speculation, conflation, false equivalencies, it also creates space for disarticulated fragments to be recomposed. The Internet has become a new archive where discarded data points, recontextualized images, and revisited documents circulate outside credentialed channels. The Tartarian question is no longer one of institutional consensus. It is a question of public epistemology, of who is allowed to interpret what and under what constraints. There are also deeper philosophical implications. Tartaria reveals that absence in the historical record is not synonymous with non-existence. What is not recorded may still have happened. What is not taught may still be true. The process of forgetting is often political, structured, and executed with precision. The tools of erasure, renaming, recoding, redating, reframing, are rarely documented themselves, yet they are embedded in every narrative that claims to speak for the past. Tartaria is not the only casualty of this process, but it is among the most visible. Yet Tartaria is also a test, a way of measuring the readiness of modern society to confront its own historical scaffolding. It tests the flexibility of academic institutions, the openness of public inquiry, and the resilience of epistemological boundaries. It asks whether we are capable of incorporating structural uncertainty into our models of the past, or whether we will continue to defend coherence at the expense of complexity. It is a challenge to consider that history is not just what we remember, but what we have been allowed to remember. This does not mean that Tartaria must be accepted in its most speculative forms. It does not validate every map anomaly or energetic theory, but it does require a serious reckoning with how quickly such possibilities have been dismissed, not on evidentiary grounds, but on methodological exclusion. Tartaria invites not belief, but vigilance. It is not a substitute for history. It is a lens for seeing what history refuses to see. In this way, Tartaria serves a triadic role. As mirror, it reflects the blind spots of the institutions that construct historical knowledge. As question, it destabilizes the foundations of time, space, and civilization as currently understood. As catalyst, it pushes inquiry beyond disciplinary limits into the contested terrain where memory, method, and myth overlap. It demands no final answer. It asks only that we acknowledge the erasures, follow the inconsistencies, and refuse to confuse institutional silence with objective absence. History is not a closed book. It is an evolving ledger, amended, redacted, footnoted, and republished. Tartaria may never return to its former position on the maps. It may remain a phantom, a rumor, a symbol. But in its absence, it speaks. It reminds us that what has been lost may still matter, and what has been denied may still be true.